Hey friends, welcome to the Horror Sleep. Almost 90% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these true park ranger horror stories, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps the channel. Oh, and where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. My name is Colt Marman, and I've been working as a forest ranger in Thunder Basin National Grassland for about 11 years. If you're unfamiliar with the area, Thunder Basin is one of the most remote places in the 48 contiguous states of the United States. The 572,000-acre shortgrass prairie, sagebrush fields, and barren land stretch as far as the eye can see on a clear day, allowing you to see the curvature of the earth. Most people don't realize that grasslands can be just as unforgiving as any mountain range or dense forest. Out here, there's nowhere to hide when weather turns bad, and the landscape plays tricks on your eyes. What looks like it's a mile away might be 3, and that figure you think you see moving in the distance could be a pronghorn, could be heat shimmer, could be your mind filling in blanks that shouldn't be filled. This particular incident happened during early October of last year, right when we start getting our first hard freezes at night. I'd been assigned to patrol the northern section of the grassland, an area we call Red Valley because of the rusty-colored clay formations that cut through the prairie like old scars. It's beautiful country, but it's also the kind of place where cell service doesn't exist, and if your truck breaks down, you'd better hope someone notices you're missing before exposure gets you. I started my patrol around 6 in the morning, just as the sun was starting to paint the eastern sky with those deep oranges and purples that make you remember why you took this job in the first place. The temperature was hovering around 32 degrees, cold enough that my breath fogged in the cab of my truck, even with the heater running. I had my thermos of coffee, my radio, and about 8 hours of driving and hiking ahead of me. The air had that crystalline quality it gets in October, where everything seems sharper and more defined. I could see for miles across the prairie, watching the shadows of morning clouds slide across the grassland like dark ships on a golden ocean. A small herd of pronghorn watched me pass from about 200 yards away, their white rumps bright against the tawny grass. This was the part of the job I loved most, these quiet morning hours when it felt like I had the whole world to myself. The first few hours were routine. I checked in at a couple of the more popular primitive camping areas, made sure no one had left trash behind, documented some fresh pronghorn tracks, and noted that the cottonwoods along Lodgepole Creek were finally starting to turn yellow. At one site, I found where someone had built a fire ring with rocks, which wasn't allowed in this section of the grassland. So I dismantled it and scattered the ashes. Standard stuff. Around 8:30, I stopped at a high point along the track and got out to do a visual sweep of the area with my binoculars. This was part of my routine, a habit I'd developed over the years. From elevated positions, you could often spot things you'd miss from the truck. Illegal off-road vehicle tracks, signs of poaching, injured wildlife, or people who might be in trouble. The grassland looked empty in every direction, nothing but rolling prairie and the distant red smudge of the Badlands formations that marked Red Valley proper. I poured myself another cup of coffee from my thermos and leaned against the hood of my truck, taking a moment to just breathe and appreciate where I was. The wind was starting to pick up like it always does mid-morning, making the prairie grass ripple in waves. I watched a golden eagle circling high above, probably hunting for prairie dogs. Life felt simple and good in that moment. But around 9:30, as I was driving along one of our unnamed 2-track roads that cuts through the heart of Red Valley, I saw something that made me slow down. There was a vehicle parked about 200 yards off the main track, sitting in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Now, that in itself wasn't necessarily unusual. We get hunters, photographers, and people who just want to experience the solitude. But something about this particular vehicle caught my attention. The driver's side door was hanging wide open. I stopped my truck and sat there for a moment studying the scene. The vehicle wasn't moving. No one was visible around it. The door just hung there, motionless despite the breeze that had started to blow across the valley. I waited, thinking maybe someone had just stepped out to take photos or answer nature's call. But after a full 5 minutes, there was still no sign of movement. I pulled my truck off the track and started driving across the prairie toward the vehicle, moving slowly to avoid damaging the fragile ecosystem. The grass here was sparse, interspersed with patches of exposed clay and small clusters of sagebrush. As I got closer, I could make out that it was a dark blue Ford Explorer, probably mid-2000s model, with Wyoming plates. The grass around it was undisturbed, except for a single set of tire tracks leading to where it sat. No other vehicles, no tent, no camping gear visible from the outside. What struck me most was how neat everything looked. The tire tracks were clear and direct, no swerving or sliding. Whoever had driven here had known exactly where they were going and had parked with precision. But then, why leave the door open? Why leave the vehicle unattended in such a vulnerable state? I parked about 20 feet away, positioning my truck so I had a clear view of the Explorer and the surrounding area. Years of training had taught me to always be aware of potential threats, even in seemingly empty wilderness. I grabbed my radio. "This is Ranger Merriman," I called in to dispatch. "I've got an abandoned vehicle at approximately mile marker 7 on the Red Valley North Track. I'm going to approach and investigate." "Copy that, Colt," came the voice of Marla Bishop, our dispatcher. She'd been working at Thunder Basin almost as long as I had. "Keep us updated." I stepped out of my truck and immediately noticed how quiet it was. Now, the grassland is always quiet, but this was different. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. The wind had died down completely, which was strange for this time of morning. Usually, by 9 or 10, you've got a steady breeze pushing across the prairie. As I walked toward the Explorer, I noticed the headlights were off. But when I got close enough to touch the hood, it was cool. Not cold, but cool. That told me the engine hadn't been running recently, at least not within the last few hours. I called out, "Hey, is anyone here? This is the Forest Service. Just checking to make sure everything's okay." Nothing. Just that heavy silence pressing down on everything. I looked through the open driver's side door. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position. There was a woman's purse on the passenger seat, a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder, and a road atlas folded open to Wyoming. The interior was neat, no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing that would indicate violence. But there was also no indication of where the driver had gone or why they'd left the door open. I walked around the vehicle looking for footprints in the dirt and sparse grass. The ground was hard and dry, not ideal for tracking, but I should have been able to see something. Disturbances in the vegetation, scuff marks in the clay, anything. But there was nothing. It was as if whoever had been driving this vehicle had simply vanished the moment they opened that door. That's when I noticed the wind had picked up again, but only slightly. It was making a low, whistling sound as it moved through the ravines and gullies that cut through Red Valley. And for just a second, I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like a voice mixed in with it. But when I stopped and really listened, there was nothing but wind. I went back to my truck and called it in again. "Marla, I've got what looks like an abandoned vehicle here. Driver's door open, keys in the ignition, personal belongings inside. No sign of the driver. I'm going to check the registration and see if I can get an ID." I went back to the Explorer and carefully reached into the glove compartment, trying not to disturb anything more than necessary. The registration was there, along with an insurance card. The vehicle was registered to a Diane Patricia Hulcom, address in Casper. I relayed this information to Marla, who said she'd run the name and see if there were any missing person reports filed. While I waited for her to get back to me, I decided to do a more thorough search of the immediate area. I walked in an expanding circle around the vehicle, starting close and working my way out. The terrain here was typical of the Badlands sections of Thunder Basin. Clay formations, scattered sagebrush, patches of shortgrass, and occasional rocky outcrops that jutted up like broken teeth. About 50 yards from the vehicle, I found something. It was faint, but there, in the clay, I could make out what looked like the beginning of a footprint. Just one. A woman's shoe, based on the size and shape, probably a hiking boot or trail runner. But here's what was strange. It was only one print, and it pointed away from the vehicle, heading north toward a series of deeper ravines. I followed the direction it was pointing, scanning the ground carefully, but I couldn't find another print anywhere. It was like whoever had made that single footprint had taken one step and then simply lifted off the ground. I know how that sounds. I'm not someone who believes in aliens or supernatural nonsense. I've been doing this job long enough to know that there's usually a rational explanation for everything. But standing there in that silent valley, looking at that single footprint that led to nowhere, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time out in the grassland. I felt watched. My radio crackled. "Colt, this is Marla. I've got something on that name." Diane Hulcom, aged 43, reported missing by her husband 2 days ago. She told him she was going on a solo camping trip to Thunder Basin and was supposed to return yesterday evening. He called it in to Campbell County Sheriff's Office last night when she didn't show up. 2 days. That meant she'd been out here for at least 2 nights, possibly longer. And in October, with nighttime temperatures dropping below freezing, that wasn't good. If she was injured, disoriented, or lost, she might not have much time left. "I need to start a search," I told Marla. "Can you contact Campbell County and let them know we've located her vehicle? I'm going to see if I can pick up any kind of trail." "Already on it," she replied. "I'll also notify our other rangers in the area. How do you want to proceed?" "I'm going to follow that ravine system to the north. That's the direction the only footprint I found was pointing. If she's out there, she might have sought shelter in one of the deeper gullies. Be careful, Colt, and keep your radio on." "Always do," I said, and signed off. I went back to my truck and grabbed my search pack. It had everything I'd need for an extended search. Extra water, first aid kit, emergency blanket, flares, protein bars, and a handheld GPS unit. I also grabbed my binoculars and my sidearm. The sidearm wasn't for any person. We rarely have issues with violent individuals out here, but mountain lions and the occasional aggressive bull elk can be a problem during certain times of the year. Before I started my hike, I took one more look at that Explorer. The open door bothered me more than it should have. I walked around the vehicle one more time, checking every detail. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone probably around 5'6" or 5'7". There were crumbs on the center console, suggesting someone had eaten while driving, maybe trail mix or granola. A pair of sunglasses sat in the cup holder next to the water bottle. Everything about the scene suggested normalcy. Someone on a day trip, someone who planned to come back. The only thing that was abnormal was that open door and the absence of the driver. I checked the rear cargo area through the back window. There was a sleeping bag, a small cooler, a backpack with camping gear strapped to it. Everything you'd need for a solo camping trip, all still there. If Diane had gone hiking, she'd gone with minimal gear. Maybe just water, and maybe not even that. I thought about the single footprint I'd found, pointing north toward the ravines. Why would someone leave their vehicle with the door open and walk off into one of the most rugged sections of the grassland with no gear? It didn't make sense, unless she'd heard something, unless she'd seen something, or unless something had called to her. I shook off that thought and started walking north, following the direction of that single footprint. The terrain got progressively more rugged as I moved away from the relatively flat area where the explorer was parked. The clay formations grew taller and more numerous, creating a maze of narrow passages and dead ends. The ravines here could be anywhere from 10 to 30 feet deep, with steep walls that would be difficult to climb without proper equipment. The wind was picking up again, and it was making that sound I'd noticed earlier, a low whistling that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It was the kind of sound that makes you constantly glance over your shoulder, even though rationally you know it's just air moving through rock formations. I stopped every 100 yards or so to scan the area with my binoculars and call out, "Diane, this is the Forest Service. If you can hear me, call out." My voice echoed off the clay walls and then was swallowed by the vastness of the grassland. Each time I was met with silence, not even birds. I realized I hadn't seen or heard a single bird since I'd found the vehicle. That absence bothered me more than I wanted to admit. This area should have been full of life. Horned larks, meadowlarks, ravens, hawks. But there was nothing. Just that wind and that oppressive silence underneath it. After about 20 minutes of searching, I found another footprint. It was faint, just a partial impression in a patch of softer clay near the entrance to one of the deeper ravines. But it matched the size and pattern of the first print I'd found. Diane had definitely come this way. I followed the ravine deeper into the Badlands. The walls here rose about 15 feet on either side, creating a narrow corridor that blocked out much of the sky. The temperature seemed to drop as I moved deeper, and the wind sound grew louder, more insistent. I had to resist the urge to turn around and go back to my truck. After about 45 minutes of searching, I came to a junction where 3 ravines met. The walls here were particularly steep and striated with bands of red and gray clay that spoke to millions of years of geological history. I stood at the center of the junction and slowly turned in a circle, examining each possible route. That's when I saw it. About 30 feet up the wall of the western ravine, there was something that didn't belong. It looked like fabric, maybe a piece of clothing, caught on a small outcropping of rock. I got out my binoculars and focused on it. It was definitely fabric, a dark green or maybe dark blue material, and it was moving slightly in the breeze that had started to pick up again. The problem was, there was no way someone could have climbed up there without gear. The clay walls were too smooth, too steep, and even if they had somehow managed it, why? Why would you climb up a sheer wall in the middle of nowhere? I radioed in my position, and what I'd found, spires. Then started looking for a way to get closer to that piece of fabric. There was no direct route, but I noticed a series of natural steps and ledges on the eastern wall of the junction that looked like they might provide access to a higher elevation. From there, I might be able to get a better look at whatever was caught on that outcropping. The climb took longer than I expected. The clay was crumbly in places, and I had to test each handhold carefully before putting my weight on it. But after about 20 minutes of careful climbing, I managed to get to a ledge that was roughly level with where the fabric was hanging, just on the opposite side of the ravine. I got out my binoculars again and studied it more carefully. It was definitely a piece of clothing, and from what I could tell, it looked like it had been torn, not just caught and left there. The edges were ragged, and there were what looked like dark stains on the material. I couldn't be sure from this distance, but something about those stains made my stomach tighten. I scanned the area around the fabric, looking for any other signs of Diane Hulcom. That's when I noticed something else. About 10 feet below the outcropping, there was a dark opening in the rock face. It was small, maybe 3 feet across and 2 feet high, but it was definitely some kind of cave or hollow. I studied that opening for a long time through my binoculars. Something about it made me deeply uncomfortable, though I couldn't say why. It was just a hole in the rock, probably formed by erosion over thousands of years, but the longer I looked at it, the more wrong it felt. And then I saw movement. It was subtle, just a shift in the shadows inside that opening, but I definitely saw something move. I kept my binoculars trained on the spot, barely breathing, waiting to see if it would happen again. It did. This time I could make out what looked like a hand, pale and dirty, reaching out from the darkness and then withdrawing quickly. My heart started pounding. That could be Diane Hulcom. She could be injured, trapped in that hollow, unable to call out for help. I grabbed my radio. Marla, I think I found her. I'm at the 3 Ravine Junction about a mile north of the vehicle. There's a hollow in the western wall, approximately 40 feet up. I saw movement inside. I'm going to try to make contact. Colt, wait for backup. Marla's voice crackled back. We've got 2 other rangers about 30 minutes out. I might not have 30 minutes, I responded. If that's her, she could be badly injured. I'm going to try to talk to her, at least establish contact. I cupped my hands around my mouth and called out across the ravine. Diane, if that's you, I'm here to help. I'm a ranger with the Forest Service. Can you hear me? Nothing, just the wind whistling through the ravines. I tried again, louder this time. Diane Hulcom, your husband sent us to find you. You're safe now. Can you respond? This time, I heard something. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it sounded like a voice. Or maybe more like a whimper, high-pitched and weak. It came from the direction of that hollow. I'm coming to get you, I called out. Just hold on. I started looking for a way to get across to the western wall. The ravine at this point was about 40 feet wide, too far to jump even if I had been crazy enough to try. But about 30 yards to my left, the ravine narrowed considerably. I might be able to find a way across there and then work my way back along the western wall to the hollow. I started moving along the ledge, testing each step carefully. The wind had picked up significantly now, and it was making that strange whistling sound again, almost like words being spoken just below the threshold of understanding. I tried to ignore it and focus on finding safe footing. When I reached the narrow section of the ravine, I found that it was actually possible to cross. There was a natural bridge of sorts, a thick slab of harder rock that had resisted erosion better than the surrounding clay. It was only about 2 feet wide, and there was a 30-foot drop on either side, but it looked stable. I called in my position again and then started across. Halfway over, a gust of wind hit me hard enough that I had to crouch down and grab the rock to keep from being blown off balance. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time. Help me. It was coming from the direction of the hollow, but it sounded wrong. The tone was right, desperate and pleading, but there was something off about the way the words were formed, like someone trying to mimic human speech without quite understanding how it works. I made it across the bridge and started working my way along the western wall toward the hollow. The going was slow. I had to move horizontally across the cliff face, using small irregularities in the rock as handholds and footholds. More than once I sent small cascades of loose clay tumbling down into the ravine below. As I got closer to the hollow, I called out again. Diane, I'm almost there. Can you tell me if you're injured? The response came quickly this time. Hurt. Can't move. Please hurry. But the voice still sounded wrong. And now that I was closer, I could hear something else. A wet, clicking sound underneath the words. Like someone trying to talk with a mouth full of mud. I was about 10 feet from the hollow when I smelled it. It was a smell I'd encountered before during my time as a ranger, when I'd come across dead elk or pronghorn that had been left in the sun too long. The sweet, cloying smell of decay. But there was something else mixed in with it. Something that reminded me of wet metal and old pennies. Blood, my brain supplied helpfully. "You're smelling blood." I stopped moving and studied the hollow more carefully. The opening was even smaller than it had looked through the binoculars, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. And the smell was definitely coming from inside, rolling out in waves that made my stomach turn. Something was very wrong here. Every instinct I'd developed over 11 years of ranger work was screaming at me to back away, to call for help, to not go any closer to that dark opening in the rock. But I also knew that if Diane Hulcom was in there, if she was injured and dying, I might be her only chance. "Diane," I called out, my voice cautious now. "I need you to come out where I can see you. I can't reach you where you are." Silence. The clicking sound had stopped. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving nothing but that heavy, oppressive quiet I'd felt earlier by the explorer. Then, "Can't move. You have to come in, please." The voice was clearer now that I was closer, and that's when I really started to understand that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just that the voice sounded odd, it was that it sounded like someone speaking phonetically, like they were reading words off a page but didn't understand the meaning behind them. There was no emotion, no real distress, just the words themselves delivered in a flat, mechanical cadence. "Please," the voice said again. "Hurts. Need help." But the words didn't match. There was no pain in the voice, no urgency. It was like listening to a recording of someone asking for help, played back at the wrong speed. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it into the opening. The beam didn't penetrate far, maybe 6 or 7 feet before the hollow seemed to curve or narrow. The floor of the cave was disturbed, that much I could see. There were drag marks in the dirt, deep furrows that suggested something heavy had been pulled from the entrance deeper into the darkness. I could see disturbed dirt and what looked like dark stains on the rock walls. In the very back, just at the edge of where my light could reach, I thought I saw something pale and motionless. That's when I saw the hand again. It reached out from the shadows, moving slowly, almost deliberately. This time I got a good look at it in the beam of my flashlight, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. The skin was gray and waxy, the color of old meat. The fingernails were broken and bloody, some torn completely off, leaving raw, dark nail beds. But worse than that, the joints were wrong. The fingers bent backward slightly as if the bones had been broken and reset incorrectly. And the wrist, when it extended further into the light, showed what looked like deep lacerations, the kind you'd get from being dragged across rough stone. This was not the hand of someone who was injured and hiding. This was the hand of someone who had been dead for at least a day, maybe longer. The hand grasped at the air for a moment, the fingers moving in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of a spider testing a web. Then it withdrew back into the darkness. I've seen dead bodies before. Part of ranger training includes dealing with the aftermath of fatal accidents, heart attacks on trails, even the occasional suicide in remote areas. I know what human remains look like. I know how bodies change after death. And that hand belonged to someone who had been dead for at least a day or two. Someone who should not have been moving, should not have been reaching out, should not have been capable of speech. I immediately backed away from the hollow and grabbed my radio. "Marla, I need those rangers here now, and we need to call the sheriff's office. I think Diane Hulcom is dead. Her body is in a hollow in the cliff face, but something's not right here. I also need you to patch me through to whoever's in charge of search and rescue." I immediately backed away from the hollow and grabbed my radio, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. "Marla, I need those rangers here now, and we need to call the sheriff's office. I think Diane Hulcom is dead. Her body is in a hollow in the cliff face, but something's not right here. I also need you to patch me through to whoever's in charge of search and rescue." As I was talking, I heard movement from inside the hollow. Not the sound of someone shifting position, but something being dragged across rock with deliberate force. The sound was wet and heavy, accompanied by that clicking noise I'd heard earlier, only now it was louder, more insistent. And then I heard the voice again, but this time it had changed completely. "Come in," it said, but the tone had dropped an octave, becoming deeper and rougher. The pretense of humanity was gone. "Come in and see." The words were followed by a sound I'd never heard before and hoped never to hear again. It was like a combination of grinding stone, breaking twigs, and wet meat being torn apart. Something was changing shape inside that hollow. Something was unfolding itself from whatever compressed form it had been using to fit into that small space. I started moving back toward the natural bridge as quickly as I dared, no longer caring about proper climbing technique. My only thought was to put distance between myself and whatever was in that hollow. Behind me, I could hear more movement, faster now, more urgent. Rock scraped against rock, and I heard what sounded like claws finding purchase on stone. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was emerging from the hollow, forcing its way through an opening that should have been too small for it. I couldn't see it clearly in the shadows of the ravine, and part of my brain is grateful for that mercy. What I could see was enough to send my heart hammering into my throat. It was too large, that's the first thing I noticed. The opening was maybe 3 feet across, but what was coming out was at least twice that in width. Its limbs, and there seemed to be more than 4, were too long and bent at joints that didn't correspond to any human or animal anatomy I'd ever seen. In the dim light of the ravine, it looked less like a creature, and more like a shadow that had learned to move. A dark mass that shifted and reformed as it pulled itself out of the hollow. But worst of all were the sounds it was making. That clicking had become a chattering, like teeth grinding together, and underneath that was a sound that might have been breathing but came in short, rapid bursts that no human could sustain. And still it was making that voice, Diane's voice, calling out, "Help me, please, someone help me." But the words were distorted now, stretched and compressed, like a tape recording being played at the wrong speed. I reached the natural bridge and started across, moving as fast as I could, while still being careful not to slip on the smooth rock. The drop on either side was at least 30 feet to jagged rocks below. Behind me, I could hear something climbing down the cliff face, moving with a clicking, scraping sound like dozens of insect legs on stone. The sound was getting closer. I was halfway across the bridge when I heard it reach the same level I was on. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. If I looked back, if I saw clearly what was following me, I knew some part of my mind would break. So I kept my eyes forward, focused on the eastern wall ahead of me, and moved as fast as I dared. The clicking sound was very close now, maybe only 20 or 30 feet behind me. I could hear its breathing, if that's what it was, coming in those rapid, impossible bursts, and underneath that I could hear something else, a wet, sliding sound, like an enormous slug moving across stone. I reached the eastern wall and didn't bother trying to climb down with any care or technique. I half climbed, half fell, grabbing at whatever handholds I could find, sending cascades of loose clay down into the ravine. I felt my palms scraping raw against the rough stone, felt my knees bang against rock hard enough to make me gasp, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't slow down. When I hit the ravine floor, I stumbled, nearly fell, caught myself, and then ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I ran like my life depended on it, because somewhere in the rational part of my brain that was still functioning, I knew it probably did. The clicking sound followed me, echoing off the clay walls of the ravine, seeming to come from every direction at once. I dodged around rock formations, jumped over gaps in the clay, slipped on loose gravel and caught myself on my hands, pushed back up and kept running. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like they were on fire, but fear kept me moving. And then, abruptly, the clicking stopped. I kept running anyway, not trusting the silence, my mind screaming at me that it was a trick, that the thing was still behind me, waiting for me to slow down. I ran for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few more minutes, until I finally saw my truck in the distance, with Diane Hulcom's Explorer sitting nearby like a silent witness to everything that had happened. I nearly collapsed with relief. I made it to my truck, jumped in with shaking hands, locked all the doors, which I know was probably pointless against whatever I'd just escaped from, and sat there for several long minutes, breathing hard, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, covered in dust and sweat. My eyes were too wide, showing too much white. There was blood on my hands from where I'd scraped them climbing down the cliff face, and my uniform was torn in several places. I looked like someone who'd just barely escaped something terrible. Because I had. "Marla?" I gasped into the radio. "Tell everyone to stay away from that junction. Something's out there. I don't know what it is, but it's not human, and it's dangerous." There was a long pause. "Colt, what are you talking about? Are you injured?" "I'm not injured," I said, my breathing starting to slow down. "But Diane Hulcom is dead. She's been dead for at least a day or two. And there's something else out there, something that was using her body or mimicking her voice. I know how this sounds, Marla, but I'm telling you, I saw something that wasn't human." Another pause. "Okay, Colt, just stay where you are. The other rangers are almost there, and we've got Campbell County Sheriff's Office en route. Don't go anywhere alone until they arrive." "I'm not planning on it," I said. I sat in my truck for the next 20 minutes, watching the ravines to the north, half expecting to see something emerge from them. But nothing came. The wind had died down again, and that heavy silence had returned. I sat in my truck for the next 20 minutes, watching the ravines to the north, half expecting to see something emerge from them. But nothing came. The wind had died down again, and that heavy silence had returned. The same silence I'd felt when I first approached Diane Hulcom's Explorer. It was like the grassland itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I kept my radio close, giving Marla updates every few minutes so she'd know I was okay. My hands had finally stopped shaking, but I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, checking behind me, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. I'd drawn my sidearm and placed it on the seat next to me, knowing it probably wouldn't do any good against what I'd seen, but needing the small comfort it provided anyway. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the October light had taken on that sharp, brittle quality it gets in the high plains. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful. If I hadn't just experienced what I'd experienced, I might have thought it was a beautiful day. But I knew better now. I knew what was hiding in those ravines, what was waiting in that hollow, mimicking human voices, luring people to their deaths. When Rangers Fisher and Kowalski finally arrived, along with 2 deputies from Campbell County, I'd managed to collect myself enough to give them a coherent account of what had happened. We stood between the 2 vehicles, mine and Diane Hulcom's Explorer, and I walked them through everything I'd found. The abandoned vehicle with the door open, the single footprint, the piece of fabric on the cliff face, the hollow, the hand, the voice, and finally, what had come out of that hollow after me. I could see the skepticism in their eyes when I got to the part about what I'd seen. Ranger Fisher, who'd worked with me for 6 years, kept his expression neutral, but I knew him well enough to read the doubt there. Deputy Hayes, a young guy probably in his mid-20s, barely concealed his disbelief. He kept glancing at his partner, Deputy Morrison, with an expression that clearly said, "This guy's lost it." Only Ranger Kowalski seemed to take me seriously. She was older, probably in her late 50s, and she'd been a ranger longer than I'd been alive. She'd seen things in the wilderness that couldn't be easily explained, and she'd learned to trust her instincts. When I finished my account, she nodded slowly and said, "Let's go take a look." We went back to the 3-ravine junction as a group, all of us armed. Fisher and I carried our service weapons, standard-issue Glock 22s. Kowalski had a rifle slung over her shoulder, a Remington 700 she'd owned for decades. The deputies had their own sidearms and shotguns retrieved from their vehicles. If there was something dangerous up in those ravines, we were as prepared as we could be. The walk to the junction took about 40 minutes, following the same route I'd taken earlier. As we got closer to the ravine system, I noticed the same thing I'd observed before: the absence of wildlife. No birds, no rabbits, not even insects seemed to be moving in this area. The others noticed it too. I could see them glancing around, hands resting on their weapons, sensing that something wasn't right even if they couldn't articulate what it was. When we reached the 3-ravine junction, I pointed out the western wall, the outcropping with the torn fabric, and the hollow about 40 feet up. From this distance and angle, it looked innocuous, just a dark spot in the red clay cliff face, but I knew better. I knew what was inside. Kowalski studied it through binoculars for a long time. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "I see something down there. Bottom of the ravine, about 100 yards south of that hollow." We moved cautiously along the ravine floor, the walls rising up on either side of us, creating that same oppressive feeling I'd experienced before. The wind had picked up slightly, making that whistling sound through the rock formations, but none of us spoke. We just moved forward, weapons ready, eyes scanning constantly. And then we found her. Diane Hulcom's body was lying at the bottom of the western ravine, partially hidden by a small outcropping of rock. She was on her back, one arm twisted beneath her at an unnatural angle, her legs bent in ways that suggested multiple fractures. Her eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the sky above. Her skin had taken on that grayish, waxy quality that comes after death, and there were obvious signs of predation on the exposed parts of her body. But what made me feel sick was the position of the body. She was at least 100 yards away from that hollow. If she'd fallen from up there, near where I'd seen that torn piece of fabric, she should have landed much closer to that spot, unless something had moved her. Unless something had dragged her body down here, away from the hollow, after I'd fled. Deputy Morrison immediately called it in, requesting a coroner and crime scene techs. While we waited for them to arrive, we documented the scene as best we could with the equipment we had. Fisher took photos, Kowalski sketched the layout in her notebook, and I stood guard watching that hollow up on the cliff face, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us back. The coroner arrived about 2 hours later, along with crime scene investigators from the sheriff's office. They spent another 3 hours processing the scene, taking measurements, collecting samples, documenting injuries. The preliminary cause of death was determined to be a combination of blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from significant height, along with exposure and probable internal injuries that would have led to death within hours, even if she'd been found immediately. But the coroner also noted something that troubled him. Some of the injuries on the body didn't match the pattern of a fall. There were drag marks on the back of her jacket and jeans, deep scratches that suggested she'd been pulled across rough ground for some distance. And there were other marks, on her arms and legs, that looked almost like bite marks but didn't match any animal he was familiar with. While the coroner worked, Kowalski organized a team to investigate the hollow. Fisher, both deputies, and Kowalski herself made the climb up to the outcropping. I stayed below, ostensibly to maintain scene security, but really because I couldn't bring myself to go back up there. I'd seen enough. They were up there for almost an hour, and when they came down, all of them looked shaken. Fisher's face had lost some of its skeptical edge. Deputy Hayes, who'd been so dismissive of my story earlier, wouldn't meet my eyes. It was Kowalski who gave me the report. "You were right," she said simply. "Something's been living in that hollow, maybe for a long time." She described what they'd found: the scratch marks on the walls, deep gouges in solid rock that would have taken incredible strength to create, the bones of various small animals, some old enough to be partially fossilized, and the human remains, pieces of clothing, items that looked like they'd been there for decades, and the skull, the old skull they'd found at the very back of the chamber, partially buried in the accumulated dirt and debris of years. It was being carefully extracted and bagged as evidence, but Kowalski told me what it meant. "This isn't the first time," she said. "Whatever's in that hollow, it's been here for a long time. And Diane Hulcom wasn't its first victim. The sheriff's office sent it to the state crime lab in Cheyenne for analysis, and 6 weeks later, we got the results. The skull belonged to a male, aged approximately 30 to 40, and based on certain indicators, he'd died sometime between 1950 and 1970. They ran the DNA and got a hit in a missing persons database. His name was Robert Kilpatrick, a geologist from Colorado who disappeared in 1962 while conducting a survey of the Thunder Basin area. He'd been alone when he vanished. His vehicle was found parked along an old access road, not far from where we found Diane Hulcom's Explorer. The door had been left open. The official explanation from the sheriff's office was that Diane Hulcom had gotten disoriented while hiking, fallen into the ravine system, and been injured. She'd managed to crawl or drag herself to the hollow seeking shelter, but died from her injuries and exposure before help could arrive. As for the thing I saw and heard, they suggested I'd been experiencing a combination of stress, the tricks of light and shadow in the ravines, and the way wind can create sounds that seem almost like voices. As for the drag marks and the scratches and the bones in the chamber, they attributed those to mountain lions or possibly wolves, even though neither species is common in that area. The coroner noted that there was some tissue damage to Diane Hulcom's body consistent with scavenger activity. I didn't argue with their conclusions. What would be the point? I'd be the crazy ranger who believes in monsters. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I know that something came out of that hollow after me. Something that had learned to mimic human voices, probably by listening to the people who fell or were lured into those ravines over the years. The Park Service closed access to the Red Valley area for 2 months while they conducted what they called a comprehensive safety review. When they reopened it, they installed warning signs about the dangers of the ravine systems and the importance of staying on marked trails. They also sealed up the hollow with concrete and steel mesh, officially to prevent wildlife from nesting there. But I think they knew something was wrong about that place, even if they wouldn't say it out loud. The sheriff's office sent the skull to the state crime lab in Cheyenne for analysis, and 6 weeks later we got the results. The skull belonged to a male, aged approximately 30 to 40, and based on certain indicators including dental work and bone density, he'd died sometime between 1950 and 1970. The lab was able to extract enough DNA from the teeth for testing, and they ran it through multiple databases, including missing persons records going back to the 1940s. They got a hit. His name was Robert James Kilpatrick, a geologist from Boulder, Colorado, who disappeared in September of 1962 while conducting a survey of the Thunder Basin area for a mining company. He'd been 34 years old, recently married, with a newborn daughter waiting for him back home. According to the missing person report filed by his wife, Robert had been working alone in a remote section of the grassland, taking soil samples and mapping geological formations. He was supposed to check in by radio every evening at 6 o'clock. When he missed his check-in on September 19th, search parties were dispatched. They found his vehicle 3 days later, parked along an old access road that no longer exists, about 2 miles from where Diane Hulcom's Explorer had been found. The description in the report made my skin crawl. The vehicle was undisturbed, his equipment was still inside, and the driver's side door was standing wide open. Robert Kilpatrick was never found. The search was called off after 2 weeks when weather turned bad and early snow made the area impassable. His wife never remarried. Their daughter grew up never knowing her father. And for 60 years, no one knew what had happened to him, until we found his skull in that hollow. The FBI got involved after the identification was made, mainly because the case crossed state lines and involved deaths separated by decades. They sent a team of agents and specialists to examine the hollow and the surrounding area. I was interviewed multiple times, always by different agents, each one asking me to recount what I'd seen and heard in progressively more skeptical tones. The official explanation they eventually settled on was almost laughable in how it tried to rationalize the irrational. According to their report, Diane Hulcom had gotten disoriented while hiking, possibly suffering from early-stage hypothermia despite the relatively daytime temperatures. She'd wandered into the ravine system, lost her bearings, and either fallen or climbed up to the hollow seeking shelter. The injuries to her body were consistent with a fall from height, and the drag marks could be explained by scavenger activity, probably mountain lions or possibly coyotes, though neither species is particularly common in that specific area. As for what I'd seen and heard, they suggested I'd been experiencing a combination of psychological stress, the acoustic tricks that wind can play in rock formations, and the way shadows can create illusions in areas with complex topography. One agent, a woman in her 40s who seemed slightly more open-minded than her colleagues, suggested that I might have encountered a bear or mountain lion that had been using the hollow as a den, and that my fear had transformed it in my mind into something more threatening than it actually was. I didn't argue with their conclusions. What would be the point? I'd be the crazy ranger who believes in monsters, and my career would be effectively over. Besides, I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. And no amount of rationalization or official reports was going to change that. The hollow itself was sealed up about 3 months after Diane Hulcom's body was recovered. The Park Service hired a contractor to fill the opening with concrete and cover it with heavy steel mesh, ostensibly to prevent wildlife from nesting there and to eliminate it as a potential hazard to visitors. But I think they knew something was wrong about that place, even if they'd never admit it officially. I attended Diane Hulcom's funeral. I felt I owed her that much, even though I'd never met her in life. Her husband was there, a man in his late 40s with gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd stopped seeing anything but the past. He thanked me for finding her, for bringing her home so she could have a proper burial. I accepted his thanks but felt no sense of accomplishment. I'd found her body, yes, but I hadn't saved her. I'd barely saved myself. After the funeral, I started having nightmares. I'd dream I was back in that ravine, climbing toward the hollow, and I'd hear Diane's voice calling out for help. But in the dreams, I'd go inside. I'd crawl into that dark opening, and I'd see what was really in there. What had been living in that hollow for decades, maybe longer. I'd wake up gasping, covered in cold sweat, the smell of decay still in my nostrils. I started seeing a therapist, someone recommended by the Park Service's Employee Assistance Program. I didn't tell her everything, couldn't tell her everything because I knew how it would sound. Instead, I focused on the trauma of finding a dead body, the stress of a search and rescue operation gone wrong, the weight of feeling like I'd failed someone who'd needed help. It helped a little. The Park Service offered me time off, but I refused. I needed to keep working, needed to stay in the field, needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going to let fear control my life. So I went back to my patrols, back to Thunder Basin, back to the grasslands that had been my home for 11 years. But I avoid Red Valley now. I avoid that three-ravine junction. The official reason I give is that the area has been closed to public access while ongoing geological assessments are conducted, which is technically true. But the real reason is that I can't bring myself to go back there. I can't face that sealed hollow, can't walk through those ravines, can't risk hearing that voice again in the wind. Because sometimes, on nights when the wind picks up and blows across the grassland, I can still hear it, not just in my dreams, but in reality, or what I perceive as reality. I'll be lying in bed or sitting on my porch and I'll hear someone calling out in the distance, "Help me, please. I need help." And I have to remind myself that there's no one out there, that it's just the wind, just my imagination, just the echoes of a trauma I haven't fully processed. But then I'll remember what Ranger Kowalski said when we found those bones and that skull in the hollow. This isn't the first time. And I'll think about Robert Kilpatrick, leaving his vehicle with the door open, walking into those ravines 60 years ago, following a voice that shouldn't have been there. And I'll think about all the other vehicles that might have been found over the decades, all the other open doors, all the other people who walked into that wilderness and never came back. Thunder Basin covers 572,000 acres. It's some of the most remote, least visited country in Wyoming. There are areas of the grassland that see fewer than a dozen visitors per year. There are ravines and canyons and hollows that no ranger has ever officially documented. And in those places, in that vast emptiness, anything could be hiding. The hollow we found might have been sealed, but I don't believe for a second that what was living there has simply disappeared. Something that survived for at least 60 years, probably longer, something that's learned to mimic human voices well enough to lure people to their deaths, isn't going to die just because we filled in one hole with concrete. I think it's moved. I think it found another hollow, another dark space, in another remote ravine somewhere in that vast wilderness. And I think it's waiting. Waiting for the next person to wander too far off the trail. Waiting for the next vehicle to park in an isolated spot. Waiting for the next voice to respond when it calls out for help. 6 months after we sealed the hollow, a hiker reported hearing someone calling for help near Lodgepole Creek, about 8 miles from the three-ravine junction. Rangers searched the area for 2 days but found nothing, no signs of distress, no abandoned vehicles, nothing but empty grassland and the wind whistling through the ravines. 3 months after that, a photographer claimed he'd heard a woman crying somewhere in the Badlands near Spotted Horse Creek. He was adamant that he'd heard it clearly, had even tried to follow the sound to offer help, but had gotten disoriented in the maze of clay formations and eventually given up. When rangers checked his story, they found nothing. These reports keep coming in once every few months. Someone hears a voice in the wilderness. Someone finds an abandoned vehicle with the door open. Someone sees something moving in the shadows of the ravines that doesn't match any known wildlife. And each time I wonder if it's real. I wonder if that thing has found a new home, a new hunting ground. I wonder how long it will be before someone else follows that voice into the darkness and doesn't come back. I still work at Thunder Basin. I still do my patrols, check campsites, enforce regulations, help visitors, and maintain the park. It's what I know. It's what I'm good at. But I'm more careful now. I pay attention to silences that feel too heavy, to absences of wildlife that suggest predators, to wind sounds that almost seem like voices. And I make sure I'm back to my truck before the sun starts to set. Because in those moments right before darkness falls, when the light takes on that particular quality and the shadows grow long and deep, I remember standing on that cliff face, looking into that hollow, seeing that dead hand reaching out from the darkness. I remember the voice that sounded almost human but wasn't, calling out in Diane Hulcom's voice, asking me to come closer, to come inside, to see what was waiting in the dark. And I remember the sound it made when it came after me, that clicking, chittering, inhuman sound of something that should not exist, something that has been hiding in the wilderness for longer than any of us have been alive, something that has learned to use our voices against us, to exploit our instinct to help those in need, to turn our compassion into a trap. I think about Diane Hulcom often. I think about the moment she heard that voice calling from the ravines, calling for help, and how she must have felt compelled to respond. She was probably a good person, the kind of person who wouldn't ignore someone in distress. That goodness, that human decency, is what killed her. And I think about Robert Kilpatrick walking through these same Badlands 60 years ago, hearing that same voice, making that same decision to help. I think about his wife back in Colorado, waiting for him to come home. I think about his daughter growing up without a father, never knowing what happened to him until we found his skull in that hollow. How many others were there? How many people over the decades, maybe over the centuries, heard that voice and followed it into the darkness? How many vehicles have been found with their doors open, their owners vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and grief? The grassland doesn't give up its secrets easily. It's too vast, too remote, too empty for us to ever know for sure. But sometimes, when I'm out on patrol and the wind is blowing just right, I'll stop my truck and listen. And in that wind, in that constant sound that defines this place, I'll hear echoes of voices. Help me. Please, I'm hurt. Come find me. And I have to remind myself over and over that those voices aren't real. They're just the wind, just my imagination, just the memory of something I saw and heard that I'm still trying to process. But then I'll remember that hand reaching out from the darkness, and I'll wonder if somewhere out there in Thunder Basin, in some other hollow, in some other ravine, something is waiting. Something that's been waiting for a very long time. Something that knows how to call out in voices that sound human, that sound desperate, that sound like they need our help. Something that's very, very patient. And I'll drive a little faster. I'll keep my radio close. I'll check my mirrors more often. And I'll make absolutely certain that I'm not out in those ravines when darkness falls. Because I've learned something about the wilderness that I wish I never had to learn. Sometimes, when you hear someone calling for help in the darkness, the kindest thing you can do is walk away. Sometimes, the voices in the wind are not the voices of the lost. Sometimes, they're the voices of the things that make people lost. And once you've heard those voices, once you've seen what speaks them, you can never completely unhear them. They stay with you, forever. My name is Abigail Row, and for the past 4 years, I've been working as a ranger at Thunder Basin National Grassland in northeastern Wyoming. Before that, I spent 6 years with the Bureau of Land Management down in New Mexico, managing public lands in the high desert country near the Gila Wilderness. I thought I knew remote. I thought I understood what real isolation felt like. But Thunder Basin taught me I'd only been scratching the surface. The grassland covers more than 500,000 acres of prairie, badlands, and sagebrush country. It's the kind of place where you can drive for an hour without seeing another human being, where cell service is a distant memory, and where the wind never stops blowing. The locals will tell you that if the wind ever does stop in Thunder Basin, you should probably start worrying, because that means a storm is coming. I transferred up here in the spring of 2019, looking for a fresh start after a difficult divorce. My ex-husband had been another BLM ranger, and working in the same region after the split had become impossible. So when a position opened up at Thunder Basin, I jumped at it. New state, new landscape, new challenges. I figured it would be good for me. For the most part, I was right. The work kept me busy. The landscape was hauntingly beautiful in its own stark way. and the small ranger community at Thunder Basin welcomed me without too many questions about my past. I learned the territory, memorized the maze of two-track roads and primitive trails, studied the wildlife patterns and weather systems. Within 6 months, I felt like I'd been there my whole life. The incident I'm about to tell you about happened in late August of last year, during what should have been a routine search and rescue operation. It was the kind of case we handle several times a season. A solo hiker who'd ventured off trail and failed to return at the expected time. Usually, these cases resolve within a few hours. The hiker turns up with nothing worse than dehydration and embarrassment, having gotten turned around in the sameness of the prairie or delayed by taking photos of wildlife. But this case was different. This case stayed with me in ways I'm still trying to process. It started on a Thursday morning when I got a call from our dispatch coordinator, a guy named Evan Whitworth, who'd been working at Thunder Basin for almost 15 years. Evan was one of those people who seemed to know everything about everyone in the park, and he had an uncanny ability to predict where lost hikers would turn up based on nothing but his gut feeling and decades of experience. "Abigail, we've got a possible missing person," he said over the phone, his voice carrying that particular tone of concern that meant this wasn't a false alarm. Male, mid-30s, name of Marcus Hendricks. He was camping at the Spotted Horse Creek dispersed site. His girlfriend called it in about 20 minutes ago. He went for a sunrise hike yesterday morning and never came back to camp. I glanced at my watch. It was just past 8 in the morning. "How long has he been missing?" "About 26 hours, Evan replied. She waited until evening yesterday, thinking he'd just gone longer than planned. When he didn't return by dark, she tried his cell phone, but there's no service out there. She decided to wait until morning, thinking maybe he'd gotten disoriented and was waiting for daylight to find his way back. When he still wasn't there at dawn, she drove to the nearest town and called us from a payphone. 26 hours in August heat with potentially no water wasn't good, but it also wasn't immediately life-threatening if the person had any outdoor experience. I grabbed my gear. What do we know about him? Experience level, what was he wearing? Did he have supplies? According to the girlfriend, he's an experienced hiker. Former Army, did a tour in Afghanistan. She says he's in good shape, knows basic survival skills. He left camp wearing hiking boots, cargo shorts, a gray t-shirt, and a red ball cap. He had a day pack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and a knife. No GPS, no radio. Any idea where he was planning to go? She says he mentioned wanting to explore the old riverbed north of the camp. Said something about wanting to photograph the sunrise over the Badlands formations up that way. The old riverbed. I knew the area Evan was talking about. Technically, it was called Dry Creek, though the name was misleading because there was no creek anymore. Just a wide, sandy channel that had been carved by water thousands of years ago. It stretched for about 12 miles through some of the most isolated country in the entire grassland, cutting between walls of eroded red clay and sandstone. The terrain was difficult, full of dead-end gullies and false passages. If Marcus Hendricks had gotten lost in there, finding him could take days. "I'm heading out now," I told Evan. "Can you get someone else out there to help with the search?" "Already on it. I've got Kowalski and Fisher en route. They should be there within the hour. I'll coordinate from here and keep you updated if we get any new information." "Copy that. I'll check in when I reach the girlfriend's location." The drive out to Spotted Horse Creek took me about 40 minutes, following a network of increasingly rough two-track roads that tested the suspension on my truck. The landscape here was classic Thunder Basin. Rolling prairie, broken up by isolated mesas, and the occasional cluster of cottonwoods marking where water might appear during wet years. The morning sun was already intense, promising a hot day ahead. The temperature was probably hovering around 75 degrees at this hour, which meant it would easily hit the high 90s by afternoon. When I pulled into the dispersed camping area, I found Marcus Hendrick's girlfriend standing next to a dusty Subaru Outback. Her arms wrapped around herself despite the heat. She looked like she was in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that were red from crying or lack of sleep. Probably both. "I'm Ranger Row," I said, approaching her with my hand extended. "You must be the person who called about Marcus." She shook my hand with a grip that was stronger than I expected. Sarah Mitchell, is there any news? Has anyone found him?" "Not yet, but we've got multiple rangers heading out to search the area. I need you to tell me everything you can remember about yesterday morning. What time did Marcus leave? What exactly did he say he was planning to do? Did he seem okay? Any indication he was upset or might have intentionally stayed away?" Sarah took a deep breath and launched into her account. They'd arrived at the camping area 2 days earlier, planning a long weekend of hiking and photography. Marcus was an amateur photographer, apparently quite good, and he'd been excited about capturing the unique light conditions of the Badlands at sunrise. Yesterday morning, he'd woken up around 5:30, well before dawn, and had kissed her on the forehead before leaving camp. He said he was going to hike north along the old riverbed, she explained. He wanted to get about 2 or 3 miles in, find a good vantage point overlooking the formations, and set up for the sunrise around 6:15. He figured he'd spend an hour or two taking photos, then hike back and be at camp by 10 at the latest. When he wasn't back by noon, I started getting worried, but I thought maybe he'd gotten really into photographing something and lost track of time. Marcus does that sometimes. When he's got a camera in his hands, hours can pass without him noticing. "And when did you decide something was really wrong?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "When it got dark and he still wasn't back. Marcus wouldn't stay out after dark without his headlamp, and that was still here at camp. Plus, he knew I'd worry. He wouldn't do that to me intentionally. Something happened out there. Something went wrong." I spent another 20 minutes gathering details. Marcus's physical condition, excellent. His mental state, happy, excited about the trip. His outdoor experience, extensive, including desert survival training from his military days. And his equipment, everything appropriate, except he'd left his GPS watch at camp because it was charging. Sarah also gave me a photo of Marcus from her phone, which I transferred to mine. It showed a fit man with short dark hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and the confident smile of someone comfortable in wild places. After assuring Sarah that we'd find Marcus and getting her to promise she'd stay at camp in case he returned, I gathered my search pack and headed north toward the old riverbed. The terrain here was relatively flat for the first half mile, covered in shortgrass prairie and scattered sagebrush. But as I got closer to where the riverbed began, the landscape changed. The ground started to slope downward, and the vegetation thinned out. Soon, I was walking on exposed sand and gravel, following what had once been a substantial watercourse. The riverbed itself was about 40 feet wide, bounded on both sides by gently sloping banks that rose maybe 10 or 15 feet. The sand was packed hard in most places, marked with the tracks of various animals: pronghorn, coyotes, rabbits, birds. I moved slowly, scanning constantly for any sign of human passage. The wind had picked up, blowing steadily from the west, making a constant rustling sound as it moved through the sparse vegetation on the banks. After about a mile, the character of the riverbed began to change. The banks grew steeper and higher, forming walls of stratified red and tan clay. The channel narrowed and deepened, creating a winding corridor that blocked much of the peripheral vision. This was Badlands country proper, and it was easy to see how someone could get disoriented here. Every turn in the riverbed looked like every other turn, and the walls were high enough now that you couldn't see the surrounding prairie to get your bearings. I called out regularly as I walked. "Marcus, this is the Forest Service. If you can hear me, respond." My voice echoed off the clay walls, sounding small and swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. I checked my GPS unit every few minutes, marking my route so I could retrace my steps if needed. Around the 2-mile mark, I stopped to check in with Evan on my radio. The handheld units we used operated on their own frequency network, independent of cell towers, with enough power to reach our relay stations positioned throughout the grassland. In theory, we should have decent coverage in most areas, though the Badlands formations could sometimes cause dead zones. "Row to base, do you copy?" The response came back clearly. "Copy, what's your status?" "I'm about 2 miles into the Dry Creek riverbed heading north-northwest. No sign of Hendricks yet." "What's the ETA on Kowalski and Fisher?" "They're at the girlfriend's location now. I'm sending Kowalski to parallel your route along the eastern rim of the riverbed, and Fisher's going to work the western side. If Hendricks is somewhere between you three, we should be able to triangulate his position." "Good plan. I'll continue north for another mile, then start working my way back south along a different route. If I haven't found anything by then, we'll need to expand the search grid." "Understood. Be advised, we're looking at temperatures hitting 96 degrees by mid-afternoon. If Hendricks is out there without adequate water, time is becoming a factor." "I'm aware. I'll pick up the pace." Row out. I continued north, moving faster now, my eyes constantly scanning the sand for footprints. The walls for any sign someone had climbed up or fallen down. The sparse vegetation for torn clothing or discarded gear. The riverbed continued its winding path through the Badlands, occasionally narrowing to as little as 20 feet across, then widening again to 50 or 60 feet. The walls grew progressively higher, now towering 30 feet or more on either side. It was in one of these narrower sections, about 3 miles from where I'd started, that I heard it. My radio crackled, and through the static came a voice. It was male, choked, and desperate, speaking in a harsh whisper that barely qualified as speech. "Help. Please. Can't breathe. Riverbed. Help." The transmission cut out as abruptly as it had started. I grabbed my radio and keyed the mic. "This is Row. Was that Hendricks? Did anyone else hear that?" I waited, my heart pounding. The seconds stretched out. Finally, Evan's voice came back, and there was confusion in his tone. "Row, say again? We didn't receive any transmission except yours. What did you hear?" There was a voice on my radio. Male, sounded distressed. Said he couldn't breathe and mentioned the riverbed. I assumed it was Hendricks trying to call for help. A longer pause this time. Then Evan came back, and now there was something else in his voice. Concern, maybe, or skepticism. "Abigail, that's not possible. You're the only ranger in that area with a radio on our frequency. Kowalski and Fisher are still en route to their search positions. And even if it was Hendricks, he doesn't have a radio. His girlfriend confirmed that. I know it doesn't make sense, but I heard it. Clear as I'm hearing you right now. Could it have been interference from another frequency? Sometimes we pick up transmissions from truckers or other agencies if atmospheric conditions are right. It came through on our channel, Evan. And the voice mentioned the riverbed specifically. Someone was calling for help from this location." Another pause. I could almost hear Evan thinking through the possibilities. "Okay, mark your current position and start searching the immediate area. Maybe someone else is out there. Another hiker who got into trouble. I'll check with Campbell County Sheriff and see if they have anyone operating in the area who might be using similar frequencies." "Copy. But Evan," the voice said they couldn't breathe. "That sounds like a medical emergency. If it was Hendricks, he might be having a cardiac event or some kind of respiratory crisis." "Understood. Search carefully but quickly. And Abigail, keep your radio on and keep me updated. If you hear that voice again, try to get a bearing on it. See if you can determine which direction it's coming from. Will do. Row out. I looked around the section of riverbed where I was standing. The walls here were steep and smooth, offering few handholds. But there were some areas where erosion had created shallow alcoves and overhangs, places where someone could potentially take shelter from the sun. I started working my way along the base of the western wall, checking every shadowed area, every depression, every spot where someone might have collapsed. Nothing. No sign of Marcus Hendricks. No gear, no footprints in the sand, nothing to indicate anyone had been here recently. I moved to the eastern wall and repeated the process. Still nothing. The wind had picked up, gusting strong enough now to raise small dust devils in the open sections of the riverbed. It made a strange sound as it funneled through the narrow passages, a low moaning that was almost voice-like. I could understand how early settlers in this region might have attributed supernatural qualities to these badlands. The wind here seemed alive, seemed to be speaking in languages just beyond human comprehension. I was about to move on when my radio crackled again. This time the voice was even more desperate, the words coming in short, painful gasps. Here. Down here. Hurry. Please hurry. I keyed my mic immediately. Evan, I'm hearing it again. That voice. It's asking for help, saying it's down here somewhere. Evan's response came back quickly, and now I could hear real concern. Abigail, I'm telling you, there's no one else on this frequency. Kowalski and Fisher both report they can't hear anything unusual, and our relay station isn't picking up any transmissions except yours. That's impossible. I'm hearing it right now, clear as day. Abigail, listen to me. I need you to check your radio. Sometimes when batteries start to fail, the units can pick up old transmissions, recordings that got cached in the memory. It's rare, but it happens. I pulled my radio from my belt and examined it. The battery indicator showed a full charge. Everything looked normal. My battery is fine. This isn't a malfunction, Evan. Someone is out here and they're in trouble. Then why can't we hear it? Why isn't the transmission going through our relay system? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. I'm going to search every foot of this area until I find whoever is making that call. Abigail, stop. Think about this logically. If someone is on our frequency calling for help, there's no physical way for you to be the only one receiving the transmission. Radio waves don't work like that. Either everyone in range hears it, or no one does. Then, how do you explain what I'm hearing? Evan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. I think you might be experiencing what happens when people spend too much time in isolated conditions with high stress levels. The mind can create sounds, especially when you're actively listening for something. You're looking for Hendricks, you're worried about finding him in time, and your brain might be manufacturing what you want to hear. I felt a flash of anger. I'm not hallucinating, Evan. I know what I heard. I'm not saying you're making it up. I'm saying our brains can trick us, especially in environments like this. The wind, the echo effects, the acoustic properties of these rock formations, they can all combine to create sounds that seem like voices. Add in the stress of a search operation, and it's perfectly understandable if you're hearing things that aren't there. I wanted to argue, but part of me wondered if he might be right. I'd been so focused on finding Marcus, so determined to locate him before the heat became life-threatening, that maybe I was imagining distress calls. Maybe my subconscious was trying to help by creating the very thing I was listening for. Okay, I said finally. Maybe you're right. But I'm going to continue the search anyway. Even if the radio calls weren't real, Hendricks is still out here somewhere. Agreed. Kowalski and Fisher are in position now. We're going to do a coordinated sweep of the area. Just stay alert, stay hydrated, and remember that not everything you hear out there is real. Understood, row out. I clipped the radio back to my belt and stood there in the riverbed, listening to the wind, feeling foolish and frustrated. Was Evan right? Had I been hearing things that weren't there? It seemed impossible. The voices had been so clear, so distinct. But I also knew that human perception was fallible, especially under stress. I decided to continue north for another half-mile, then work my way back in a zigzag pattern to cover more ground. As I walked, I tried to keep my mind clear, to not anticipate hearing anything, to just let the search unfold naturally. The temperature continued to climb. By my watch, it was approaching 11 o'clock, and the sun was beating down into the riverbed like a physical force. I could feel sweat soaking through my uniform shirt, and I stopped regularly to drink from my water bottles and pour some over my head to cool down. At the 3.5-mile mark, the riverbed divided. The main channel continued northwest, but a smaller tributary branched off to the northeast. I checked my GPS and compared it to my mental map of the area. The tributary was shorter, maybe only another mile before it dead-ended at the base of a mesa. If Marcus had explored that direction, he might have found himself trapped at the end with no easy way out. I decided to check the tributary first. The channel here was narrower, maybe 25 feet across, and the walls were even higher, creating a deep slot that blocked out most of the sky. The temperature actually dropped a few degrees in the shade, which would have made this an attractive route during the heat of the day. If Marcus had been hiking in the morning sun and had found this cooler passage, he might have followed it out of curiosity. I'd gone maybe 200 yards into the tributary when my radio crackled again. But this time the voice was different. It was still male, still distressed, but clearer than before, more coherent. "I'm in the side channel, east wall, can't climb out. Ankle broken, been here since yesterday. Please, I need help." My hand went to my radio, but I hesitated. If Evan was right, if I was hallucinating these transmissions, then responding to them would only confirm his concerns. But if he was wrong, if someone was really out here calling for help, then ignoring the calls could mean someone's death. I made a decision. Even if the voices weren't real, I was already in this tributary, already searching it. I might as well be thorough. And if by some chance I was hearing real transmissions through some weird atmospheric phenomenon or radio anomaly, then following the voice might actually lead me to someone who needed help. I started examining the eastern wall more carefully, looking for any alcoves, caves, or recesses where someone might be sheltered. The wall here was a mix of sandstone and clay, heavily eroded, with numerous small openings and crevices. Most were clearly too small for a person, but some were large enough that I had to investigate. In one of these larger openings, about 20 feet up the wall, I saw something that made me stop. There was a piece of fabric, dark red in color, caught on a sharp projection of rock. It was fluttering in the wind, and from this distance I couldn't tell if it was old or recent, but it was definitely human-made. I studied the wall beneath the fabric. There were what looked like hand and footholds, a natural path that someone could have used to climb up, but many of the holds looked crumbling and unstable. If Marcus had tried to climb up there, perhaps to get a better vantage point for photography, he could easily have fallen. I keyed my radio. "Evan, this is Row. I'm in the eastern tributary of Dry Creek, about 3.5 miles north of the original starting point. I found what might be a piece of clothing caught on the wall, red fabric about 20 feet up. I'm going to investigate. Copy, Row. Kowalski is about half a mile west of your position. I'll redirect her to your location as backup. Don't attempt any climbing until she arrives. Understood, but I'm going to get closer and see if I can identify the fabric. It might not be related to our missing person." I approached the wall carefully, my eyes scanning for the best route up. The handholds looked sketchy, but they were there. I'd done plenty of scrambling in my time with BLM, and this didn't look beyond my abilities. But I decided to respect Evan's instruction and wait for backup. While I waited, I called out, Marcus Hendricks, if you can hear me, call out. I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help." The wind carried my words away, and there was no response except the ever-present moan of air moving through stone channels. I stood there, staring up at that piece of red fabric, wondering if I'd found him, if Marcus was up there somewhere, injured and unable to respond. My radio crackled and I tensed, expecting another of those mysterious transmissions. But it was Evan's voice, normal and clear. "Row, Kowalski is approaching your position from the west. She should be there in 5 minutes. In the meantime, I've got an update on Hendricks." I spoke with the girlfriend again, asked her more detailed questions about what he was wearing. She says his ball cap was red, but his shirt was definitely gray, not red. So, if that's red fabric you're seeing, it might not be from him. Copy that. I'll wait for Kowalski before investigating further. But as I stood there, I heard it again. The voice on my radio, weaker now, barely audible over the static. "Hurry. Please. Not much time. Getting dark? Getting dark?" I looked up at the sky. It was barely noon, the sun at its highest point. Why would anyone say it was getting dark? Unless the transmission wasn't happening now. Unless somehow I was hearing something from the past, from last night when it actually was getting dark. But that was impossible. Radios didn't work like that. There was no mechanism by which a transmission from yesterday could suddenly replay on my unit today. I was still puzzling over this when I heard footsteps crunching on the sand behind me. I turned to see Ranger Kowalski approaching. Her rifle slung over her shoulder, her face flushed from exertion and heat. She was in her mid-50s, a tall woman with gray hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. "What have we got?" she asked, breathing only slightly harder than normal, despite having covered rough terrain at speed. I pointed up at the red fabric. That could be a ball cap, could be a piece of clothing. Evan says Hendricks was wearing a red cap, so it might be him. Kowalski pulled out binoculars and studied the fabric for a long moment. It's a cap. Looks relatively new, not sun-faded. And I can see what looks like a logo on it. Can't make out what it says from here. She lowered the binoculars. "We need to get up there." "I'll go," I offered. "I've got more recent climbing experience than you." Kowalski gave me a look that was almost amused. "I was scrambling around Badlands formations before you were born, kid. But sure, you go first. I'll spot you and be ready to catch you if those handholds give way." We approached the wall together, and I started climbing. The holds were as sketchy as they'd looked, crumbling under my hands in places, forcing me to test each one carefully before putting my weight on it. Kowalski stayed directly below me, calling out warnings and suggestions, ready to break my fall if I slipped. It took me about 5 minutes to reach the level of the red cap. Up close, I could see it was definitely a baseball cap, relatively new, with a logo I recognized as a local brewery from Gillette. The cap was caught on a sharp point of rock, and there was no way it had gotten there by accident. Someone had been up here, and either they'd lost the cap while climbing, or they'd fallen and it had been torn from their head. I looked around the immediate area, searching for any other signs of Marcus. The ledge here was narrow, maybe 18 inches wide, running horizontally along the wall for about 10 feet before disappearing into a vertical crack in the stone. To my right, where the ledge ended, there was a dark opening, a cave or recess that extended back into the wall. "Kowalski," I called down. "There's a cave up here. I'm going to check it out. Be careful. Don't go deep without backup." I edged along the ledge toward the opening, my back pressed against the wall, my boots finding precarious purchase on the narrow path. When I reached the cave entrance, I pulled out my flashlight and shone it inside. The cave was shallow, maybe 8 feet deep and 6 feet across. The floor was covered in sand and small rocks, and there, at the very back, partially covered by debris that had fallen from the ceiling, I saw something that made my breath catch. It was a boot, a hiking boot, still laced, attached to a leg that disappeared under a pile of rock and sand. I'd found Marcus Hendricks, and from the look of things, I'd found him too late. "Kowalski," I called down, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need you to call this in. I've got a body up here. Looks like he was caught in some kind of rock fall or ceiling collapse." I heard Kowalski swear softly, then the sound of her keying her radio to report to Evan. While she did that, I carefully made my way into the cave, stepping cautiously to avoid disturbing the scene more than necessary. I needed to confirm whether this was actually Marcus, and whether there was any chance, however slim, that he might still be alive. I knelt beside the visible boot and started carefully moving some of the smaller rocks aside. As I worked, more of the leg became visible, then a torso, then finally a face. It was Marcus Hendricks. I recognized him from the photo Sarah had shown me. His eyes were closed, his skin was pale, and there was a nasty gash on his forehead that had bled significantly. I reached out and touched his neck, checking for a pulse even though I was certain I wouldn't find one. But I was wrong. There was a pulse. Faint, slow, barely there. But it was definitely a pulse. Marcus was alive. I yanked my radio from my belt. "Evan, this is Row. I've got Hendricks and he's alive." Barely, but alive. "I need medevac and I need it now. He's trapped under rocks in a cave. Possible head injury, definitely dehydration, maybe internal injuries. I'm about 3.5 miles north of the starting point, in the eastern tributary of Dry Creek at GPS coordinates." I rattled off the numbers from my unit. Evan's response was immediate and professional. "Copy that, Row. I'm calling for emergency helicopter transport now. Nearest available unit is out of Gillette, ETA approximately 25 minutes. Can you stabilize him until they arrive?" "I'm already doing it. Row out." I set down my radio and focused on Marcus. First priority was clearing the rocks off him without causing further injury. Many of the rocks were small enough to lift easily, but a few were substantial, requiring leverage and careful movement. Kowalski had climbed up to join me, and together we worked to free Marcus from the debris. As we worked, I pieced together what must have happened. Marcus had climbed up here, probably drawn by the cave entrance and thinking it might provide an interesting photographic angle or just a cool place to rest out of the sun. He'd gone into the cave, and at some point, part of the ceiling had collapsed. The sound of falling rock in this acoustic environment might have been what spooked him into trying to climb out, but the debris had caught him, probably hitting him in the head and knocking him unconscious. He'd been lying here ever since, probably bleeding slowly, definitely dehydrating, but protected from the worst of the heat by the cave's shade and the insulating effect of the rock pile. Once we had him mostly uncovered, I did a quick assessment. The head wound was serious but had clotted. His breathing was shallow but regular. His pulse was weak. His skin was hot to the touch, indicating fever or heat stress. He didn't respond to verbal commands or physical stimulation. He was in bad shape, but he was alive, and that meant he had a chance. Kowalski and I did what we could with the supplies we had. I started an IV line to get fluids into him, covered him with an emergency blanket to stabilize his body temperature, dressed his head wound, and administered basic first aid. Kowalski set up a signal mirror outside the cave entrance to help guide the helicopter to our location. While we waited, I couldn't stop thinking about those radio transmissions I'd heard. The voice calling for help, saying it was in the side channel, saying it couldn't breathe, saying it was getting dark. All of those transmissions had led me here to this exact spot where Marcus was dying. But how? How was that possible when Evan insisted there was no one else on our radio frequency? When the transmissions weren't going through the relay system, when no one else could hear them? I looked at Marcus's unconscious face, and a thought occurred to me. When he'd been trapped here, had he been conscious for any period of time? Had he tried to call for help? But he didn't have a radio, Sarah had confirmed that. Unless he'd found one. Unless there was an old radio in this cave, left behind by someone years ago, and in his desperation Marcus had tried to use it. I started looking around the cave more carefully, and that's when I saw it. Partially buried under sand in the corner, almost invisible in the shadows, was a black case. I moved over to it and brushed away the sand. It was a radio case, old and weathered. Inside was a handheld unit, similar to the ones we used but an older model, probably from the 90s based on the design. The battery compartment was corroded, the antenna was broken, and the whole thing looked like it hadn't been functional in decades. But next to the radio, under more sand, I found something else. A wallet. I pulled it out and opened it, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a driver's license, the plastic yellowed and cracking with age. The license belonged to Robert James Kilpatrick, the same geologist whose skull we'd found in that hollow months ago, the man who'd disappeared in 1962. The license showed an issue date of 1961. Kowalski leaned over my shoulder to look. Is that? Yeah, it's Kilpatrick's wallet. He must have made it to this cave before whatever happened to him. And he had a radio with him, but that radio's been dead for decades, Kowalski said. It couldn't have been transmitting anything. It's not even possible. The battery is completely corroded. I know, but I heard something. Those transmissions led me here. They led me directly to Marcus. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Sometimes this land does strange things to sound. Echoes that bounce around for hours. Refractions in the air that carry voices for miles. Temperature inversions that create acoustic channels. Maybe what you heard was Marcus calling out when he first got trapped, and the sound just took a while to reach you. Some weird acoustic phenomenon that we don't fully understand. That doesn't explain why it came through my radio." "No," she admitted, "it doesn't. But I don't have a better explanation." Neither did I. And 25 minutes later, when the helicopter arrived and we loaded Marcus onto the stretcher and watched him being lifted out of that cave and flown toward the hospital in Gillette, I still didn't have an explanation. Marcus Hendricks survived. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital being treated for severe dehydration, a skull fracture, a concussion, internal bleeding from a ruptured spleen, and about a dozen other complications. But he survived, and 3 months later, I received a letter from him thanking me for finding him when I did. The doctors told him that another hour or two and the internal bleeding would have killed him. In the letter, Marcus mentioned something interesting. He said that after the rocks had fallen on him and he'd regained consciousness for a brief period before passing out again, he'd tried to call for help. He remembered shouting until his voice gave out, remembered trying to move but being unable to, remembered the crushing certainty that he was going to die there. He asked if I'd heard him calling. He said he had a vague memory of hearing a woman's voice responding, telling him help was coming, but he didn't know if that was real or just a hallucination brought on by his injuries. I never told him about the radio transmissions. I never told him that I'd heard a voice calling from the exact spot where he was trapped, even though every logical explanation said it was impossible. I never told him about Robert Kilpatrick's radio, or the strange coincidence that both men had ended up in the same cave decades apart. Some things don't have explanations, at least not ones that make sense in our normal understanding of how the world works. Evan was right about that. The acoustics of the Badlands can do strange things. Echo effects, refraction, atmospheric conditions, they can all conspire to create illusions of sound. Add in the stress of a search operation, the heat, the isolation, and the human brain's tendency to find patterns even where none exist, and you have a perfect recipe for hearing things that aren't there. That's the rational explanation, and I've tried to accept it. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I remember that voice on my radio. I remember how clear it was, how specific the instructions were, how it led me directly to where Marcus was dying. And I wonder if somehow, in some way we don't understand. Marcus's desperation to survive, his need to call for help, had reached across the space between us. Not through radio waves, but through something else. Something we don't have instruments to measure or theories to explain. Or maybe I wonder if it was Robert Kilpatrick's voice I heard, echoing across 60 years, still calling for help from the same cave where he'd eventually died. His voice trapped in that stone like his bones had been trapped in that hollow. Maybe his call had been waiting all this time for someone to hear it, someone to be in the right place at the right time with the right frequency. I don't know. I'll probably never know. What I do know is this. I still work at Thunder Basin. I still do search and rescue operations. And I still carry my radio with me everywhere I go. But now, when I hear something that seems impossible, when a transmission comes through that shouldn't exist, I don't immediately assume it's a malfunction or a hallucination. Instead, I listen. I listen very carefully. Because maybe, just maybe, impossible transmissions are the ones we need to hear most. Maybe the voices that shouldn't exist are the ones that save lives. Maybe the spaces between rational explanation and irrational experience are where the real work of rescue happens. I found Marcus Hendricks because I heard something impossible. I followed a voice that wasn't there, or shouldn't have been there, or was there in some way that transcends our normal understanding of physics and reality. And he's alive because I didn't dismiss that voice. Because I trusted my experience over everyone's explanations. Because I believed that sometimes in the remote places of the world, in the isolated Badlands where rock and wind and time all press together, the rules we think are fixed become fluid. I've never heard another impossible transmission. The radio incident stopped after that day, and my equipment has functioned normally ever since. Evan never brings up the subject, though I sometimes catch him watching me with a thoughtful expression, like he's reassessing his understanding of what's possible. Sarah and Marcus sent me a Christmas card last year. They got married in October, a small ceremony in the mountains of Colorado. In the card, Sarah wrote that they'd never forget what I did, how I'd saved Marcus's life against all odds. She said she prays for me every night, asks whatever forces govern the universe to keep me safe while I'm out there in the wilderness helping people. I appreciated the prayer. Because the truth is, I'm not entirely comfortable with what happened. Part of me wishes I could believe Evan's explanation, that it was all just acoustic phenomena and stress-induced auditory hallucinations. That would be easier to live with. But I can't shake the memory of that voice, the desperation in it, the specificity of the information it provided, the way it guided me step by step to exactly where I needed to be. And I can't shake the image of Robert Kilpatrick's radio, that dead, corroded piece of equipment that couldn't possibly have transmitted anything, sitting in the same cave where Marcus Hendricks was dying 60 years later. Coincidence? Maybe. Probably even. But in the quiet moments when the wind is blowing across Thunder Basin and making that voice-like sound in the ravines and gullies, I allow myself to consider other possibilities. I consider that maybe the land remembers. Maybe these Badlands, shaped over millions of years, carved by water and wind and time, have developed their own way of holding information. Maybe distress calls don't just dissipate into the air, but get caught somehow in the rock formations, stored like recordings in the layers of sandstone and clay, waiting to be played back when conditions are right. Or maybe, when someone dies calling for help, their need is so strong that it leaves an imprint, an echo that persists beyond their death, still crying out for rescue that never came. And maybe sometimes, just sometimes, that echo reaches someone who can answer it, even if they're answering 60 years too late. Or maybe I'm just trying to make sense of something that has no sense, trying to find meaning in random chance and acoustic anomalies. I don't know, and that's okay. I've learned to live with not knowing. What I do know is that I'll never ignore a voice calling for help, no matter how impossible it seems. I'll never dismiss a transmission as a malfunction without investigating first. And I'll never stop listening to those radio frequencies, even in the dead zones, even in the places where the equipment tells me there can't possibly be a signal. Because Marcus Hendricks is alive today because I heard the impossible. And maybe, just maybe, the next impossible transmission I hear will save someone else. The radio sits on my desk now as I write this. Its green display showing a full battery charge, its antenna extended and ready to receive. Outside my window, the wind is blowing across Thunder Basin, making that endless sound that defines this place. And I'm listening. Always listening. Just in case. My name is Shane Toiver, and I'm a field geologist working for a consulting firm based out of Casper, Wyoming. For the past 8 years, I've been conducting surveys throughout the western United States, analyzing soil composition, mapping geological formations, and assessing mineral deposits for various clients. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. I spend most of my time alone in remote areas, taking samples, recording data, and trying to understand the story that rocks tell about how the Earth was formed. In late October of last year, I was contracted to conduct a geological survey of a section of Thunder Basin National Grassland in northeastern Wyoming. The client was a mining company interested in exploring the viability of extracting bentonite clay from the area. My job was to map the clay deposits, determine their quality and extent, and provide an assessment of whether commercial extraction would be feasible. Thunder Basin is some of the most remote country I've ever worked in, and I've worked everywhere from the Mojave Desert to the Alaskan tundra. It's not just the physical isolation that gets to you, though there's plenty of that. It's the psychological weight of all that empty space, the way the landscape seems to absorb human presence and make it insignificant. You can stand on a rise and see for 30 miles in every direction without spotting a single structure, a single tree large enough to provide shade, a single sign that humans have ever existed. The Badlands section of Thunder Basin where I was working amplifies that feeling tenfold. These are areas where erosion has carved the earth into a maze of ravines, gullies, and clay formations painted in bands of red, gray, and tan. The terrain is nearly impassable by vehicle, so you do everything on foot, carrying your equipment through a landscape that looks like Mars might look if Mars had ever had water. I'd been working alone in the field for 3 days when I met Dean Varick. Dean was a park ranger with Thunder Basin, assigned to check on my progress and make sure I was following the terms of my permit. He drove out to my base camp on the morning of my 4th day, a Friday, arriving just as I was loading my pack for another day of field work. Dean was in his early 40s, lean and weathered in the way people get when they spend most of their time outdoors. He had that calm, patient demeanor that seems common among rangers, like he'd learned long ago that nature moves at its own pace, and there's no point trying to rush it. We shook hands, and he checked my paperwork while I finished loading my gear. "Everything looks in order," he said, handing back my permit. "How's the survey going?" "Good," I've mapped about 60% of the target area. Another week and I should have what I need." He nodded, looking out across the Badlands. "You working alone out there?" "Just me and my GPS unit." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, weighing something. "We've had some reports from this area over the past few weeks. A couple of hikers said they heard someone calling for help out in the ravines, but when we searched, we didn't find anyone. Another person claimed they found a campsite that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Food still on the fire, still warm. Tent still up. But no sign of whoever had been there. I felt a prickle of unease. Did you find them?" "No. We searched for 2 days with a full team. Dogs, helicopter, the works. Never found any trace of them. Could be they just left their gear and hiked out, but it was expensive stuff, not the kind of thing you'd abandon. And the food being warm suggests they'd been there very recently. So, what do you think happened?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I've been a ranger at Thunder Basin for 15 years. I've seen strange things that don't have easy explanations. Most of the time, there are rational explanations if you look hard enough. But sometimes there's no rational explanation. When that happens, all you can do is accept that there are things in these Badlands we don't fully understand. Are you trying to spook me?" He smiled without humor. "I'm trying to keep you safe. Keep your radio on and charged. Check in at least twice a day. If you see or hear anything unusual, don't investigate alone. Call it in and wait for backup. And if you get a bad feeling about something, trust your instincts. Get out. Don't try to rationalize it. Just get out." I nodded, taking his advice seriously. "I will. But I've been working in remote areas for 8 years. I'm careful and prepared." Careful and prepared don't always matter if you encounter something you're not expecting. Just keep that in mind. Dean left us shortly after, and I headed out into the Badlands with my equipment. My plan for the day was to work my way north along a series of ravines, taking soil samples every 100 meters and recording the depth and quality of the clay deposits. It was tedious work, but I found it meditative. There was something satisfying about the simple, repetitive nature of it. Walk, sample, record, repeat. The weather that morning was typical for late October in Wyoming. The sky was overcast, the temperature hovering around 40 degrees, with a steady wind blowing from the northwest. I was dressed in layers, thermal underwear under my work clothes with a fleece jacket and a windbreaker over that. Even with all that, the wind found ways to cut through, making me grateful for the physical exertion of hiking that kept my blood moving. I worked steadily through the morning, following my planned route through the ravines. The Badlands here were particularly dramatic, with walls rising 30 to 40 feet on either side of the ravine floors. The clay had eroded into fantastical shapes, pillars and arches and overhangs that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. The colors were muted under the overcast sky, but you could still see the distinct bands of different colored clay, geological strata laid down over millions of years. Around noon, I stopped for lunch in a wider section of ravine where I had a good view of the surrounding terrain. I pulled out my thermos of coffee and a sandwich, sitting on a flat rock while I ate and reviewed my morning's data on my tablet. Everything was looking good. The clay deposits were consistent in quality and more extensive than the initial surveys had suggested. My client would be pleased. I was about to pack up and continue working when I saw something that caught my attention. About 50 yards up the ravine, partially hidden behind a jutting section of clay wall, there was a splash of bright color that didn't belong in this landscape of muted reds and grays. I stood up and walked toward it, curious about anything that seemed out of place. As I got closer, I realized what I was seeing. It was a backpack, a modern hiking pack with an internal frame, probably 60 or 70 liters in capacity. It was sitting upright against the ravine wall, positioned as carefully as if someone had just set it down for a moment. I stopped about 20 feet away and studied it. The pack was dark green with gray accents, an Osprey brand based on the logo. It looked relatively new, not sun-faded or heavily worn. All the zippers were closed, the straps were neatly tucked, and the top flap was secured. Everything about it suggested someone had carefully packed it and deliberately placed it exactly where it was, but there were no footprints around it. None. I looked at the ground carefully. The ravine floor here was soft sand and clay, the kind that should show prints clearly. I could see my own tracks leading up from where I'd eaten lunch. But around the pack, nothing. The soil was undisturbed, showing the same wind-rippled texture as areas that clearly hadn't been walked on. I walked closer, examining the ground with each step. When I reached the pack, I stopped and studied it without touching anything. It was positioned perfectly, too perfectly. The bottom was flat against the ground, the back panel flush against the ravine wall, the shoulder straps arranged symmetrically. What struck me as odd was that there was no dust on it. Everything in the Badlands gets covered in dust within hours. My own pack already had a visible film. But this pack looked clean, as if it had just been placed here very recently. I pulled out my radio. This is Shane Toiver calling Thunder Basin Dispatch. Anyone copy? The response came immediately. It was Dean's voice. This is Ranger Varick. Go ahead, Shane. I found an abandoned backpack in the ravine system about 2 miles north of my base camp. It's sitting against the wall, looks deliberately placed. No sign of the owner, no tracks around it. Given what you told me this morning, I thought I should report it. There was a pause. Can you describe the pack? Dark green Osprey, probably 60-liter capacity. Looks new or nearly new. All zippers closed. Another pause, longer this time. Shane, I need you to not touch that pack. I'm going to come out there with another ranger. Can you mark your position and wait? Sure. Why? Given the recent reports from this area, I'd rather be cautious. Stay there and don't disturb anything. We'll be there in about 40 minutes. Copy that. I'll wait here. The wind had picked up, and clouds were moving in from the west, darker and heavier than the morning's overcast. It looked like we might get rain, which was unusual for late October. Most of the moisture had already left the region for the year. While I waited, I tried to understand the scene in front of me. The pack was positioned too carefully to have been dropped or thrown. Someone had placed it there deliberately. But why? And where had they gone? And most puzzling, why were there no tracks? Maybe the wind had erased them, I thought. But when I looked at my own prints, they were still clearly visible, sharp-edged in the soft clay. The wind wasn't strong enough to erase tracks that quickly. I pulled out my camera and took several photos of the scene from different angles, making sure to capture the lack of footprints around the pack. Something about this felt wrong, and I wanted documentation of everything before anyone disturbed the site. Dean arrived about 45 minutes later, accompanied by another ranger I hadn't met. The temperature had dropped noticeably and the first few snowflakes were starting to fall, melting as soon as they hit the ground. Dean introduced the other ranger as Ranger Kowalski, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She moved with the confident efficiency of someone who'd spent decades working in rough terrain. I stood up as they approached, and Dean gave me a nod of acknowledgement before his attention shifted immediately to the backpack. He stopped about 10 feet away from it, his hand coming up to halt Kowalski as well, both of them studying the scene exactly as I had done. No tracks, Kowalski observed, her voice matter-of-fact but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite identify. Interest, maybe, or concern. Except for Shane's coming from the south and ours coming from the west. The pack is isolated, no approach or departure tracks visible. She walked slowly around the area in a wide circle, her eyes on the ground, occasionally crouching to examine something more closely. I watched her work, recognizing the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd done this kind of investigation many times before. She was looking for anything that might explain the scene: disturbed vegetation, drag marks, signs of someone climbing down from the rim, anything. After a complete circuit, she stopped next to Dean and shook her head. I don't see any indication of how this got here. No drag marks, no footprints, nothing. The soil conditions are perfect for showing tracks. We can see our own prints clearly, but there's nothing around the pack itself. Could someone have climbed down from the rim? I suggested, repeating the theory I'd considered earlier. Lowered the pack with a rope and then climbed back up? Dean looked up at the ravine wall above us, tracing the height with his eyes. It was nearly vertical here, about 35 to 40 feet of smooth clay with very few handholds or ledges. The top of the wall was visible against the gray sky, and snow was starting to accumulate up there, making the edge look like it was outlined in white. Possible, Dean said slowly. Difficult, but possible. But that raises other questions. Why would anyone do that? Why go to the effort of climbing down a near vertical clay wall just to place a backpack here? And if they did climb down, we should see marks on the wall, scrapes in the clay, disturbed areas where they grabbed for handholds. I don't see any of that. Kowalski had pulled out binoculars and was scanning the rim of the ravine, looking for any sign that someone had been up there. After a minute, she lowered the binoculars and shook her head. No tracks visible on the rim either. Of course, if someone was up there earlier and this snow continues, any tracks would be covered pretty quickly. Dean pulled out a pair of latex gloves from his pack and snapped them on with practiced efficiency. The sound of the latex snapping seemed loud in the quiet ravine. "I'm going to examine the pack," he announced. "Both of you stay back and document everything. Kowalski, photos and notes. Shane, if you have a camera, additional documentation would be useful." I pulled out my camera and prepared to take photos while Kowalski did the same with her official Ranger Service camera. Dean approached the pack slowly, carefully, placing each foot deliberately to avoid disturbing any potential evidence. When he reached it, he knelt beside it and started his examination without touching anything at first. Just looking, his face inches from the fabric, studying it from every angle. "No dust," he observed. "Everything out here gets covered in dust within an hour or two of exposure, but this pack is clean, like it was just placed here. Or like it's been protected somehow," Kowalski suggested. "Inside something, maybe, and then taken out and positioned here, maybe." Dean leaned closer, examining the zippers and buckles. Everything is secured properly, all closures fastened. No damage to the fabric, no tears or abrasions. The shoulder straps are arranged symmetrically, tucked neatly. He pulled out a small flashlight and shone it on the pack from different angles, looking for any trace evidence. Fibers, hair, blood, anything that might provide a clue about who had handled it or where it had been. Then he reached out with his gloved hand and placed his palm flat on the bottom of the pack where it rested against the ground. What I saw happen next will stay with me for the rest of my life. Dean's hand had barely made contact with the pack for maybe 2 seconds before he jerked it back as if he'd been burned, his eyes going wide with shock. "Jesus!" He shook his hand instinctively, staring at his palm, then looking back at the pack with an expression of complete bewilderment. "What is it?" Kowalski moved closer, her voice sharp with concern. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm not hurt, but—" Dean touched the pack again, more carefully this time, keeping his hand in place longer. Then he moved his hand to different areas of the pack, the top, the sides, the shoulder straps. "The bottom of this pack is warm. Not just warm, hot. Like body temperature or maybe even warmer, but the rest of it is cold, Same temperature as the air out here." "That's not possible," Kowalski said. But she was already moving to check for herself. She placed her own gloved hand on the bottom of the pack, held it there for several seconds, then touched other areas. Her expression confirmed what Dean had said. She looked at me. "Shane, you feel this too." I want a third confirmation. I approached the pack, feeling almost reluctant now, and placed my bare hand on the bottom. The sensation was immediate and undeniable. The fabric was warm, noticeably warm, like touching someone's forehead when they have a fever. I moved my hand to the side of the pack, and the temperature difference was stark. The side was cold, probably in the low 40s to match the ambient air temperature. But the bottom was easily in the 90s, maybe higher. "It feels like someone was just sitting on it," I said, pulling my hand back. "Like body heat. But there's no one here, no tracks, no indication anyone has been near this pack." The three of us stood there in silence for a moment, snowflakes falling around us, staring at this impossible object that was simultaneously hot and cold, present but unexplained, real but wrong in ways we couldn't articulate. Dean took a deep breath and returned to his examination. "Let me check the contents. Maybe that will tell us something." He carefully unbuckled the top flap, his movements precise and methodical. The buckle released with a click that seemed loud in the quiet ravine. Then he unzipped the main compartment, the zipper sound seeming to go on forever as he slowly pulled it around the opening. Finally, he pulled the opening wide and looked inside. His expression changed, confusion replacing professional composure. "It's empty, what?" Kowalski moved to see for herself. "The pack is completely empty. Nothing inside at all." "Check the other compartments," Kowalski instructed. Dean checked them all systematically. The top pocket, where hikers usually keep items they need quick access to like snacks, sunscreen, or a first aid kit. Empty. The front pocket, typically used for maps or a water reservoir. Empty. The side pockets usually holding water bottles. Empty. The hip belt pockets where people keep their phones, car keys, or wallet. Empty. "Not just empty of gear," Dean said, his voice taking on a strange quality. "Empty of everything. Look at this." He pulled the main compartment wide open so we could see inside. The interior of the pack was pristine, like it had never been used. No dirt, no lint, no forgotten granola bar crumbs, no scuff marks from gear rubbing against the fabric. It looked exactly like a brand new pack that had just been taken out of its packaging. "That's impossible," I said. "Even if someone emptied out all their gear, there would be traces. Dirt, dust, something. This looks like it's never had anything inside it." "Except for one thing," Kowalski said quietly, pointing. We all looked where she was indicating. The outside of the pack, particularly the bottom and lower sides, was covered in dried mud. Not dust or dirt, but actual mud. Thick and caked onto the fabric in irregular smears and patches. It was dried now, cracked and flaking in places, but you could see where it had been wet and thick when it was applied. Dean stood up and looked around at the ravine. "The ground here is dry, bone dry. We haven't had any precipitation in this area for at least 3 weeks, maybe longer. Where did this mud come from?" I had no answer. Neither did Kowalski. We all stood there staring at the pack, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. An expensive pack, carefully positioned, with no tracks around it, warm on the bottom, completely empty inside, but covered in dried mud despite 3 weeks of dry weather. Dean pulled out his radio and called in to dispatch. "We need to escalate this. I'm treating this as evidence in a potential missing persons case. I want you to check recent reports. Anyone who mentioned losing a pack, anyone who filed a complaint about stolen gear, anything that might connect to a dark green Osprey backpack." While he was on the radio, I walked a wider circuit around the area. looking for anything else unusual. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. About 20 feet from where the pack sat, there was a section of the ravine wall where the clay looked disturbed, like something had scraped against it. I called Dean over. We examined it together. It definitely looked like something had made contact with the wall, leaving a smear through the thin layer of dust that coated everything in the Badlands. The smear was about 3 feet long and roughly vertical, starting about 6 feet off the ground and ending near the ravine floor. Like someone slid down the wall? Kowalski suggested. Dean shook his head. The angle's wrong. If someone slid down, the marks would be at more of a diagonal. This is almost straight up and down, like something was dragged upward along the wall. That makes even less sense, I said. How do you drag something up a vertical clay wall? There's nothing to grip onto, no way to get leverage. Dean didn't answer. He was looking up at the top of the ravine wall, his expression troubled. Then he pulled out his camera and took several photos of the scrape mark before carefully taking a sample of the clay, scraping some of it into an evidence bag. "We need to search the area thoroughly," he said. 50-meter radius from this point. Look for anything unusual. Tracks, gear, clothing, signs of disturbance. Shane, you're welcome to help, but stay within my sight line. We spent the next hour conducting the search. The light was fading as the clouds thickened, and the temperature was dropping. The wind had taken on that particular bite that suggests snow might be coming, which was definitely possible for late October in Wyoming. We found nothing. No tracks, no gear, no signs that anyone had been in this area recently except for my own prints and the ones Dean and Kowalski had made approaching the pack. It was as if the backpack had simply materialized out of thin air, been placed carefully against the wall, and then whoever had placed it had vanished without leaving a trace. As we worked, Dean's radio crackled with updates from dispatch. They'd checked recent reports and found nothing about a lost or stolen dark green Osprey pack. They'd also pulled up missing persons reports for the region going back 6 months. And while there were several open cases, none of them matched the profile of someone who might have been carrying that particular pack. When our search was complete, Dean made a decision. "I'm taking this pack back to the ranger station. It's going to be logged as evidence, and we're going to see if we can figure out where it came from. If it's connected to any of our missing persons cases, we need to know." He carefully placed the pack in a large evidence bag, documenting its position one more time before moving it. As he lifted it, I saw him pause and frown. "What is it?" Kowalski asked. "It's lighter than it should be. I mean, it's empty, so it should just weigh whatever the pack itself weighs, maybe 5 or 6 pounds. But it feels lighter than that, like it's hollow." "Packs are hollow," I pointed out. "That's kind of the point." "No, I mean..." Dean struggled to articulate what he meant. "It feels wrong. The weight distribution is off, like the fabric is there, but there's nothing inside it, not even air." "That doesn't make any sense," Kowalski said, but her tone suggested she didn't think Dean was crazy, just that what he was describing shouldn't be possible. Dean sealed the evidence bag and hoisted it onto his back. "We need to head out before this weather gets worse. Shane, thank you for calling this in. If you find anything else unusual out here, radio it in immediately. Don't investigate alone. I will, but I have to say, this is the strangest thing I've encountered in 15 years of field work." Dean's expression was grim. "It's the strangest thing I've encountered in 15 years of ranger work, and I've seen some weird stuff in these Badlands." They headed back toward their truck, and I returned to my base camp. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and by the time I reached my tent, the first snowflakes were starting to fall. I spent the evening in my tent, heating up a meal on my camp stove and trying to process what I'd seen. An empty pack with no explanation for how it got there. No tracks, despite soft ground that should show prints. warm on the bottom despite cold weather and no sun, covered in dried mud despite weeks of dry weather, and that strange scrape mark on the wall, suggesting something had been dragged upward against gravity. None of it made sense, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. I'd been working alone in these Badlands for days, and now I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought, that there was something out here I didn't understand, something that left backpacks in places they shouldn't be, and moved through the landscape without leaving tracks. I tried to sleep, but kept waking up, listening to the wind outside my tent, hearing sounds that might have been branches scraping, or might have been footsteps, might have been animals, or might have been something else entirely. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, my heart pounding, certain I'd heard someone calling my name. By morning, 6 inches of wet snow had fallen, coating everything in white and making any further fieldwork impossible. I decided to pack up my camp and head back to Casper to wait out the weather. I'd come back in a few days when conditions improved and finish my survey. As I was loading my truck, Dean drove up in his ranger vehicle. He got out and walked over to me, his expression even more troubled than it had been the day before. "I thought you should know," he said. "We got the results back from the clay sample I took from that scrape mark on the wall. And it's not the same composition as the ravine wall. The wall is predominantly Cloverleaf Formation clay, which is typical for that area. But the sample I took from the scrape mark is Lance Formation clay, which is found about 15 miles north of here. Completely different geological period, different mineral composition." I stared at him, trying to process what that meant. So something scraped against that wall, and that something had clay on it from a different location. That's what it looks like. But here's the strange part. The mud on the backpack is also Lance Formation clay. Same as the scrape mark, same as the clay found 15 miles north of here. Which means whoever left that pack had been in that northern area recently, or carried mud from there. Dean shook his head slowly. We checked the weather records for the entire region going back a month. The only place that got precipitation in the past 3 weeks was that northern section, right where the Lance Formation clay is exposed. They got a heavy thunderstorm 19 days ago, enough to turn the clay into mud. So, someone was in that northern area during or right after the storm, got mud all over their pack, then came south to where I found it. But why? And how did they get there without leaving tracks? I don't know, but there's something else. We checked the pack for any identifying marks, manufacturer codes, anything that might tell us when and where it was purchased. We found a serial number and tracked it to a retail sale. Good. So you know who bought it? Dean's expression darkened. It was purchased 18 months ago from an outdoor retailer in Billings, Montana. The buyer used a credit card, so we have a name. Thomas Brennan. Okay, have you contacted him? We tried. Thomas Brennan was reported missing 7 months ago. He was last seen camping in Thunder Basin. His truck was found abandoned at a trailhead, all his gear still inside except for one thing. His backpack. A dark green Osprey pack that his wife described in detail to the investigating officers. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. So that's his pack, the one I found. It would seem so, which raises a very disturbing question. Where has Thomas Brennan's pack been for the past 7 months? And why did it suddenly reappear yesterday in a ravine 2 miles from where his truck was found, covered in mud from a storm that happened 19 days ago, and positioned in a location impossible to reach without leaving tracks? I had no answer. Dean clearly didn't either. We stood there in silence watching the snow fall across the Badlands, turning the red and gray clay into undifferentiated white. Finally, Dean spoke again. "I need to ask you something. When you were working out here the past few days before you found the pack, Did you hear anything unusual? Voices? Calls for help? Anything that seemed out of place? I thought back. There had been that one moment, late on my second day, when I'd thought I heard someone shouting in the distance. But when I'd stopped to listen, there had been nothing but wind. I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe. One time I thought I heard someone yelling, but I couldn't be sure. It might have just been the wind playing tricks. What direction did it come from? I pointed north, from up that way, the direction of the Lance Formation clay deposits. Dean pulled out a map of the area and studied it. That's the same area where we found that abandoned campsite I mentioned, the one with food still cooking on the fire. Did you ever identify who that campsite belonged to? No. We searched missing persons reports, checked with local outdoor retailers, even posted photos online hoping someone would recognize the gear. Nothing. It's like whoever was there just vanished, and no one ever reported them missing. That doesn't make sense. Someone had to own that gear. Someone had to know them, notice they were gone. Dean folded the map and put it away. You'd think so, but sometimes people slip through the cracks. Drifters, loners, people who don't have close ties to anyone. They disappear and no one notices, or if they do notice, they don't bother reporting it. What about Thomas Brennan? He was reported missing. He was. And we searched for him for 3 weeks. Brought in search and rescue teams, dogs, helicopters, the works. Never found a trace of him. No body, no gear, no signs of what happened. Until yesterday, when you found his pack. Have you told his wife that you found the pack? Not yet. I wanted to examine it more thoroughly first, see if there's anything inside it that might tell us what happened to him. But the pack is completely empty, so I don't think we're going to find anything. What about the warmth? The fact that the bottom was hot? Dean's expression suggested this was something that troubled him deeply. We checked that. Took the pack's temperature with an infrared thermometer. The bottom of the pack was 98 degrees Fahrenheit when I first touched it. Body temperature. The rest of the pack was 42 degrees, same as the ambient air temperature. Body temperature? Like someone had been sitting on it, or like someone had been inside it. But that's impossible. The pack is nowhere near large enough to hold a person, and even if it was, why would someone climb inside a backpack? I had no answer for that. The whole thing was becoming more disturbing the more details emerged. A missing man's pack, reappearing 7 months later, impossibly warm, covered in mud from a recent storm, positioned in a place unreachable without tracks, completely empty inside. Dean seemed to sense my unease. Listen, I know this is all very strange, and I know it's probably affecting how you feel about working out here alone. If you want to postpone your survey, or if you want someone to accompany you when you continue your work, I can arrange that. I appreciate it, but I'll be fine. I've worked in remote areas for years. This is it's just unusual. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for all of it. Even as I said it, I didn't believe it, and from the look on Dean's face, neither did he. I hope you're right, he said. But I've been a ranger in Thunder Basin for 15 years, and I've seen things in these Badlands that don't have rational explanations. Or at least, not explanations that make sense within our normal understanding of how the world works. Like what? He was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding whether to share something. Finally, he spoke. About 5 years ago, we had a similar case. A woman went missing while hiking alone. We found her tent, her sleeping bag, her food, all her gear, everything except her and the clothes she was wearing. But here's the thing. All her gear was arranged in a perfect circle, like someone had deliberately laid it out that way. And in the center of the circle, there was a hole in the ground, maybe 3 feet deep, freshly dug. No tools around, no sign of how it had been dug. We never found the woman. Never found any trace of her. The case is still open. Jesus. What do you think happened to her? Dean looked out across the Badlands, his gaze distant. I think these Badlands are older than we can imagine, and I think they have their own rules. Rules that don't always align with what we think of as natural law. I think people who come out here sometimes encounter something we don't understand, something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we can't know. And I think some of those people don't come back. That's a pretty dark worldview for a park ranger. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. It's a realistic worldview when you work in a place like this. The grassland is beautiful, but it's not safe. It's not tame. And there are parts of it that we'll never fully understand, no matter how many surveys we conduct or how many maps we make. He handed me a card with his direct number. Call me if you need anything. And Shane, be careful out there. Pay attention to your instincts. If something feels wrong, get out. Don't try to rationalize it or investigate it. Just get out. I took the card and promised I would. Dean drove away, and I finished loading my truck. As I packed the last of my gear, I kept thinking about what he'd said. About the Badlands having their own rules. About people encountering something in the spaces between knowledge and mystery. I didn't want to believe it. I was a scientist, trained to look for material explanations for phenomena. But I also couldn't explain what I'd seen. That pack with no tracks around it, warm on the bottom, covered in mud from a storm weeks old, completely empty inside, despite being owned by a man who'd been missing for 7 months. I drove back to Casper that morning and spent the next 3 days in my apartment, filing my initial reports and trying to make sense of my data. But I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas Brennan's pack. I couldn't stop wondering where it had been for 7 months and why it had reappeared when and where it did. On the 3rd day, I received a call from Dean. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. We kept investigating the pack, trying to find any clues about what happened to Brennan. And yesterday, one of our techs noticed something strange. What? The pack wasn't empty. Not completely. There was something inside it that we missed during the initial examination. What was it? A layer of residue coating the entire interior, like something had been inside the pack and had left a film behind. We sent samples to the state forensics lab for analysis. The results came back this morning. Dean paused, and I could hear the reluctance in his voice to continue. It's organic matter, decomposed biological tissue, heavily degraded, mixed with that same lance formation clay we found on the outside. The lab tech said it's consistent with what you'd find if you buried something in clay and left it there for several months, then dug it up. I felt my stomach turn. Are you saying Thomas Brennan was inside that pack? That's what the evidence suggests. At least parts of him were. But here's what I can't explain. That pack is 60 liters in capacity. Even if you compressed a human body completely, you couldn't fit it inside a pack that size. It's physically impossible. So what does that mean? Dean was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know. But I've officially closed the Brennan case as a fatality. I called his wife and told her we'd found conclusive evidence of his death, though I didn't go into the details. She deserves closure, even if we can't give her a complete explanation of what happened. And what did happen? What's your official conclusion?" My official conclusion is that Thomas Brennan died of exposure or misadventure while hiking in Thunder Basin, and that his remains were subject to predation and environmental degradation. As for the pack, I'm listing it as evidence in a closed case and storing it in our facility. And your unofficial conclusion? Dean's voice was barely above a whisper. My unofficial conclusion is that Thomas Brennan encountered something in those Badlands that we don't have a name for. Something that doesn't follow the rules we think govern reality. And whatever he encountered, it left his backpack in that ravine as a message or a warning, or maybe just because it doesn't think the way we do. I returned to Thunder Basin 4 days later to complete my survey. The snow had melted except in the shadiest spots, and the weather had cleared to cold, bright autumn sunshine. I worked efficiently, taking my samples and recording my data, but I didn't enjoy it the way I had before. The Badlands no longer felt like a fascinating geological puzzle. They felt like a place where people disappeared, where objects appeared without explanation, where the rules I'd built my career on didn't always apply. I finished the survey without incident and submitted my report to the client. The bentonite clay deposits were extensive and high quality, and I recommended proceeding with extraction. The client was pleased. I got paid, the job was done, and I moved on to my next contract in Colorado. But I never went back to Thunder Basin. I tell myself it's because there's no reason to go back, that I've completed my work there, and there are plenty of other places that need geological surveys. But the truth is, I'm afraid. Afraid of what I might find. Afraid of what might find me. Because sometimes, late at night, I think about that backpack. I think about how warm it was on the bottom, body temperature as if someone had just been carrying it. I think about the dried mud from a storm weeks old, and the residue inside that suggested a human body had been compressed into a space too small to hold it. I think about the lack of tracks, the impossible positioning, the 7 months it spent somewhere before reappearing, and I wonder where it was during those 7 months. I wonder what happened to Thomas Brennan in his final moments, and whether he understood what was happening to him. I wonder if he's still out there in some form, trapped in those Badlands, existing in a state that doesn't align with life or death as we understand them. Most of all, I wonder about all the other missing people in Thunder Basin, all the open cases that Dean mentioned, all the individuals who walked into that wilderness and never walked out. I wonder if they encountered the same thing Brennan did. I wonder if there are more backpacks out there, or tents, or pieces of gear, appearing and disappearing according to rules we'll never understand. Dean called me 3 weeks after I left Thunder Basin. He wanted to let me know that another hiker had reported finding a strange object in the Badlands. A sleeping bag, laid out perfectly flat on the ground, zippered closed, with no tracks around it, and no explanation for how it got there. When rangers investigated, they found the sleeping bag was warm, body temperature, despite the freezing weather. Inside, they found the same residue that had been in Thomas Brennan's pack. They're running DNA analysis on it now, Dean told me. But I think I already know what they're going to find. I think we're going to find out this belonged to another missing person, someone who disappeared months or years ago. And I think we're going to keep finding these things. Backpacks, sleeping bags, tents, pieces of gear, all with that same impossible warmth, that same residue, that same lack of tracks or explanation. Dean was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the Badlands with an expression of deep concern. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I think these Badlands are older than we can imagine, and I think they have their own rules. Rules that don't always align with what we think of as natural law. I've worked here for 15 years, and I've learned that there are things in this landscape that we'll never fully understand, no matter how many degrees we have or how much equipment we bring. I think people who come out here sometimes encounter something that exists in the spaces between knowledge and mystery, between what we know and what we can't know. And I think some of those people don't come back, or if they do come back, they come back changed in ways we can't measure. That's a pretty dark worldview for a park ranger, I said, trying to inject some lightness into the conversation even though his words had sent a chill through me. He smiled, but there was no humor in it, only a kind of weary acceptance. It's a realistic worldview when you work in a place like this long enough. The grassland is beautiful. I love it. But it's not safe and it's not predictable. There are sections of Thunder Basin that feel wrong in ways I can't articulate. Places where the silence is too heavy, where the wildlife avoids going, where even experienced rangers feel uncomfortable. This ravine system where we found the pack, that's one of those places. I've been in this exact area maybe a dozen times over the years, and every single time I felt like something was watching me. Never seen anything, never found evidence of anything, but the feeling is always there. He handed me a card with his direct contact number. Call me if you need anything. And Shane, be careful out there. Pay attention to your instincts. If something feels wrong, get out. Don't try to rationalize it or investigate it or convince yourself you're being irrational. Just get out. I've seen too many people ignore their instincts because they thought they were being silly or cowardly. And most of those people ended up in situations they barely survived. I took the card and promised I would be careful. Dean and Kowalski drove away in their truck, and I went back to my camp to pack up for the day. The snow was falling steadily now, accumulating on the ground, making further fieldwork impossible. I decided to spend the night at my camp and reassess the situation in the morning. That night in my tent was one of the longest of my life. I kept my radio on, listening to it crackle with occasional transmissions from other rangers checking in with dispatch. The familiar sounds should have been comforting, but instead they just emphasized how isolated I was, how far from help I would be if something went wrong. I tried to sleep, but kept waking up, listening to sounds outside my tent. The wind in the sparse vegetation, the crack of ice forming on puddles, small animals moving around in the darkness. Each sound made me tense, made me wonder if it was just nature or something else, something that left backpacks in impossible places and scraped vertical walls and moved without leaving tracks. By morning, 8 inches of snow had fallen, coating everything in white and transforming the Badlands into an alien landscape. I made my decision quickly. Pack up and head back to Casper. I'd wait out the weather and come back in a week or so to finish my survey. The client would understand. Weather delays were a normal part of field work. I was loading my truck when Dean's vehicle appeared, driving slowly through the snow. He got out and walked over to me, and I could tell immediately from his expression that he had news, and that it wasn't good news. "I thought you should know," he said without preamble. "We got the results back from the clay sample I took from that scrape mark on the wall." "That was fast," I said, surprised. "Usually, lab results take days or weeks. We put a rush on it. Called in a favor from the state geology lab." Dean pulled out his notepad and flipped it open. "The clay from the scrape mark is Lance Formation, deposited during the late Cretaceous period, approximately 66 to 70 million years ago. It's characterized by a specific mineral composition and contains trace fossils from that era." "Okay," I said, not understanding why this was significant. "The ravine wall where we found the scrape is Cloverleaf Formation, from the early Cretaceous, about 110 to 120 million years ago. Completely different geological period, completely different mineral composition." I felt my stomach drop as I understood what he was telling me. So, the clay in the scrape mark didn't come from the wall it was scraped on. No, it came from somewhere else. Somewhere with exposed Lance Formation deposits. "Where's the nearest Lance Formation exposure?" "About 15 miles north of where we found the pack. In the deepest part of the Badlands where very few people go because the terrain is so difficult." So something, or someone, scraped that wall, and whatever did it had Lance Formation clay on it from a location 15 miles away. Dean nodded slowly. "And here's the thing. The mud on the backpack is also Lance Formation clay. Same geological signature, same age, same mineral composition. We ran analysis on multiple samples from different parts of the pack, and they all match. Whoever or whatever left that pack had been in that northern location, in an area with exposed lance formation deposits. I leaned against my truck, trying to process this information. When did it rain in that northern area? When could someone have gotten muddy enough to coat a backpack like that? Dean consulted his notes again. We checked weather records for the entire region going back 6 weeks. The only precipitation event anywhere in Thunder Basin during that time was a heavy thunderstorm in that northern section 19 days ago. Dropped 2 inches of rain in less than an hour. Would have turned the exposed clay into thick mud. Exactly the kind that was on the pack. So, someone was in that northern Badlands area during or right after the storm 19 days ago. They got their pack covered in mud. Then they came south, 15 miles through some of the roughest terrain in Wyoming, and somehow placed that pack in a ravine with no tracks leading to it or away from it. That's what the evidence suggests, but there's more. Dean looked uncomfortable now, like he was about to tell me something he didn't want to believe himself. We checked the pack for any identifying information. Manufacturer codes, serial numbers, anything that might tell us who bought it. We found a serial number stamped on the frame and tracked it through Osprey's database to a retail sale. Good. So you know who owned it. The pack was purchased 18 months ago from an outdoor retailer in Billings, Montana. The buyer used a credit card, so we have a name. Thomas James Brennan, aged 37, resident of Casper. Have you contacted him? Dean's expression darkened even further. Thomas Brennan was reported missing 7 months ago. He was last seen camping alone in Thunder Basin, specifically in the northern Badlands area where the Lance Formation is exposed. His truck was found abandoned at a trailhead, locked, with all his camping gear still inside except for one item, his backpack. His wife described it in detail to the investigating officers when she filed the missing persons report. Dark green Osprey, 60-liter capacity, relatively new. I felt my blood run cold. So, that's his pack. The one we found yesterday. It would appear so. We're going to confirm it with his wife, show her photos to see if she can identify any specific details, but based on the serial number and description, I'm confident it's his pack. Where has it been for the last 7 months? And why did it suddenly show up yesterday, covered in mud from a storm that happened 19 days ago, in a location with no tracks showing how it got there? Dean shook his head. Those are exactly the questions we're trying to answer. None of it makes any sense. If Brennan has been dead for 7 months, which is the most likely scenario, then who had his pack? Where was it all this time? And how did it end up positioned in that ravine in a way that seems physically impossible? We stood there in silence, snow falling around us, both of us trying to make sense of something that defied all logical explanation. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since Dean arrived. Is this why you drove all the way out here this morning? Just to tell me about the clay analysis and the serial number? No, Dean said quietly. I came out here to tell you that we kept investigating the pack after we got it back to the station. We examined it more thoroughly, under better lighting, with better equipment. And we found something we missed during the field examination. What? There was something inside the pack. Something we didn't see at first because it wasn't gear or personal items or anything you'd normally expect to find. It was a residue, a thin film coating the entire interior surface of the pack. Every compartment, every pocket, the main body, everything. Like something had been inside the pack and left this coating behind. What kind of residue? Dean pulled out his phone and showed me photos of the pack's interior under UV light. The coating was visible as a faint phosphorescent glow against the fabric. We sent samples to the state forensics lab for analysis, put a rush on it, called in every favor we had. The results came back this morning. And it's organic matter, decomposed biological tissue, heavily degraded, broken down to the molecular level, mixed with that same lance formation clay we found on the outside. The forensic analyst said it's consistent with what you'd find if you buried something in wet clay and left it there for several months, then removed it. The clay acts as a kind of seal, slowing decomposition, but also creating a very specific chemical environment that breaks down tissue in a particular way. I felt sick. Are you saying Thomas Brennan was inside that pack? Dean's voice was barely audible. That's what the evidence suggests. The residue contains human DNA. We're waiting for a complete profile to confirm it's Brennan. But given that it's his pack and he's been missing for 7 months and the timeline matches, I think we know what we're going to find. But that's impossible, I said, even though I was saying it more to convince myself than to argue with Dean. That pack is 60 liters. You can't fit a human body inside a 60-liter pack. Even if you compressed it, even if you broke every bone and forced it in, you couldn't do it. It's physically impossible. I know, Dean said. That's what I told the forensic analysts. And you know what they said? They said based on the amount of residue and the concentration of biological markers, there's no question that human remains were in that pack. But they couldn't explain how it was physically possible either. They asked if maybe it was just part of a body, maybe just an arm or a leg, something that would fit in the available space. But the DNA markers suggest tissue from multiple areas of the body: muscle, bone, organ tissue, brain matter. It's like the entire body was compressed into that pack somehow, in a way that shouldn't be physically possible. I had to sit down. I lowered myself onto the tailgate of my truck, feeling dizzy and nauseous. The snow was falling faster now, and the world had taken on that muffled quality that heavy snowfall creates, like we were inside a snow globe, cut off from reality. "What are you going to do?" I asked finally. "Officially, I'm closing the Brennan case as a fatality. I'll contact his wife and tell her we have conclusive evidence of his death, though I'm not going to go into the specific details unless she asks. She deserves to have closure, even if we can't give her a complete explanation of what happened. And unofficially, Dean said, looking out at the falling snow, I think Thomas Brennan encountered something in these Badlands that we don't have a name for. Something that doesn't follow the natural laws we think govern reality. Something that can take a human body and do things to it that shouldn't be possible, then leave evidence of what it did in places that can't be reached by normal means. I think that's what the scrape mark means, that vertical dragging motion that goes against gravity. I think whatever he encountered was trying to communicate something, or warn something, or maybe it just doesn't think the way we do, and its actions don't have meaning we can understand." He turned to look at me directly. "And I think you should finish your survey as quickly as possible and get out of here. I don't know what's in these Badlands, but I know it's dangerous in ways we can't predict or guard against. Be careful, Shane. Be very careful." After that conversation, I started paying attention to missing persons reports from Thunder Basin and the surrounding areas. There are more than I'd realized. Dozens of open cases going back decades. Hikers who went for a walk and never returned. Campers who set up their tents and vanished during the night. Geologists like me who went out to take samples and never came back. Some of them might have simple explanations. Falls into hidden ravines, heart attacks in remote areas, disorientation leading to fatal exposure. But some of them have the same markers as the Brennan case. Gear left behind in impossible configurations, no tracks, no signs of struggle, just absence where a person used to be. And now, knowing what I know, I can't help but wonder if they all encountered the same thing. If there's something in those Badlands that exists outside our understanding, something that takes people and leaves behind their gear as evidence of its existence or as trophies or for reasons we'll never comprehend. I still work as a geologist. I still take contracts in remote areas, but I turn down any work in Thunder Basin. When clients ask why, I tell them I'm overbooked or that the region isn't in my specialty area. I don't tell them the truth, that I'm afraid of what I might find there or what might find me. Because sometimes when I'm working alone in the wilderness, I think about that warm backpack sitting against the ravine wall. I think about how it had no business being there, how it defied every natural law I understand. And I wonder if the rules I've built my life around are as solid as I thought they were. I wonder if there are places in the world where those rules don't apply, where reality bends and breaks and reforms in shapes we can't predict. Places where backpacks appear without footprints, where sleeping bags hold residue of compressed bodies, where the spaces between what we know and what we don't know become hunting grounds for something we have no name for. I wonder if Thunder Basin is one of those places, and I wonder how many other places like it exist in the world, waiting for people like me to stumble into them, to find the impossible evidence, to become the next missing person whose gear appears months or years later with no explanation. I don't have answers to these questions. I don't think anyone does. All I know is that Thomas Brennan's backpack was real. The warmth I felt when Dean touched it was real. The mud from a 3-week-old storm was real. The residue inside that suggested impossible compression of a human body was real. And somewhere in the Badlands of Thunder Basin, there might be more backpacks, more sleeping bags, more evidence of people who encountered something beyond explanation. I hope I never find them. And I hope, whatever is out there, it never finds me.